you go on to camera 23. Now we're going to look at camera 23. What area of your store is camera 23?
It is the aisle that carries the ATMs.
Okay. Also looks to be like the cooler air, kind of
Cooler
towards the back,
ice,
the
and
cooler
it's the
area.
path to the beer cave, yes.
Okay.
And the time on this image?
I think we're getting it before we
Okay.
start playing.
I can't read the small print, so I don't know
Absolutely.
if it's there or not.
8:23 p.m.
Thank you.
And we're stopping it at 8:23 and 30 seconds. And then finally, I believe we are going to play camera 10. Starting it at 8:24 and 14 seconds. And stopping it at, well, it just flipped, but I believe we stopped it at 8:25. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. And we're done with that HDMI, Judge. And that was all video footage from your store in Windsor.
Correct.
I'm now going to show you what has been marked as Exhibit 406. Would you please identify what Exhibit 406 is?
It's a receipt from my store.
Okay. I would this time move Exhibit 406 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection.
Thank you.
And that was for a purchase of 2 10-pound bags of ice.
Correct.
And the time of that purchase is 8:24 p.m.
Correct.
No further questions for this one.
Cross-examination.
None, thank you.
Thank you. May this witness be excused and released.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.
The state at this time will call Vincent D'Agostini.
Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear affirm the testimony you're about to give in this matter is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Good afternoon. If you're able to safely and responsibly testify without your mask, that would be our preference if you could.
Yep.
Thank you so much. Go right ahead.
Good afternoon, sir. Please state and spell out your name for everyone typing notes here.
It's Vincent D'Agostini, Vincent D'Agostini.
And how are you employed, sir?
How am I employed?
Yeah.
Currently, I actually just accepted a job at Target, but I was previously employed with Fleet Farm.
In what role?
Loss prevention team lead.
Sure. And was that back in July of 2021?
Yes, it was.
Tell me about what your job was in general back in July of 2021 at Fleet Farm.
Basically, my job is to deter theft and to operate the CCTV surveillance system. And then also I played a role in inventory procedures as well.
In part of that role, did you sometimes have the opportunity to work with the police and as they were investigating things?
Yes, very frequently.
Could you describe, just in case everyone doesn't know, where is the Fleet Farm that we're talking about?
It's a 4630 Dalmore Road in DeForest. It's right on the corner of I-19 and Highway 90.
And at some point, were you asked to provide police some surveillance footage from inside the Fleet Farm and maybe even a little bit outside, but mostly inside on July 2nd, in kind of early in the morning, around 7:20 or so?
Yes, it was.
And did you provide the police a copy of that video ultimately?
I did.
All right, and I'll note for counsel it's marked as 407, and I'd move 407 into evidence.
No objection.
It is received.
All right, and we'll go ahead and publish that.
And it should appear on the computer monitor in front of you once it is played.
Go ahead. So we're playing clip 42. What are we looking at there, by the way?
This is our front entrance to the store.
All right, we'll go to the next clip. We're going to play clip 5-1. What are we looking at in clip 5-1?
This is our last aisle in the hardware department. And it's right next to the farm department where we keep tarps and some outdoor gear.
Okay. And I'll just draw the jury's attention to maybe that center row, someone about to cross or walk into that aisle. Whereabouts is that person at the top of the screen in the center?
That aisle is where the tarps are located.
All right, and we'll go to the next clip. And we'll play clip 56. What are we looking at there?
This is again up at the front entrance, and that would be lane 1 is the closest checkout lane there.
And do you recognize that item that the person in that video is purchasing?
Yes, I do.
And what is that?
It's a black and silver tarp.
All right, I'm going to show you a couple photographs, sir. I'll start, I guess, with a question. In addition to this video, did the police ask you to maybe look into that actual purchase itself?
Yes.
And were you able to do that in your role?
Yes, I was.
What's exhibit number 408? What does that look like to you?
This is a transaction snapshot for that transaction, or essentially a receipt for it.
And are you able to tell what the subject in that transaction purchased?
Yes, it is. It's a 6x8 silver black heavy duty poly tarp.
And is there a date and time that this was all done at?
Yes, July 2nd, 2021 at 7:21 a.m.
All right, I'll move 408 into evidence.
No objection.
It is received.
What is 409? Do you recognize that at all?
Yes, this is kind of a close-up of the card information that was used to purchase that tarp.
Okay. And does it have the same date and time stamp for the silver black heavy duty poly tarp?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And I'll move 409 into evidence.
No objection.
It is received.
And you've mentioned that tarp. Are 410 and 411, are those photographs of maybe the packaging of the tarp and maybe what would be inside?
Yes.
All right, I'll move 410 and 411.
No objection.
They are received.
All right, I'll ask to publish these on the Elmo. Sir, what's going to happen is that screen's going to come on in 1 second. We're going to show you the same pictures again. So we're looking at 408. And if we zoom in there at the top, there's the date that you were referencing, correct? The July 2nd at 7:21 a.m.?
Correct.
And a bit farther down, there's the item description of a 6x8 silver black heavy duty polytarp, quantity 1, purchased for $6.99.
Yes.
Excellent. That's the same information on Exhibit 409.
Yes, it is.
I'm covering up the remainder of the exhibit. Perhaps it has some information on it that we don't need to share. And then zooming out, just briefly, you testified that 410, that's the packaging of that tarp that was purchased,
Yes, it is.
and 411, the tarp.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Good luck in your new role.
Thank you.
Cross-examination.
Thank you. Now, sir, as part of your investigation into this, you were asked to see if that card had been used for any previous transactions, correct?
Correct.
And you were only able to locate one previous transaction, correct?
That's correct.
And that was from back in September of 2020, correct?
Correct.
That's all. Thank you.
Any redirect? And just to note, for the record, the video clips were played in their entirety.
They were all played in their entirety.
Very good. Thank you, sir. You are excused from your subpoena, and I suspect released.
You are.
Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
State will now call Dr. Breslauer to the stand.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give in this matter is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm going to ask if you would feel comfortable and believe you could safely and responsibly testify without a mask. That would be the preference if you're able to do that.
I would prefer to keep my mask on.
Very good. Then make sure, as it is now, that the microphone is very close to you. I understand, if I understood the title used in calling you, that you work in healthcare, or it has some relation to that industry. So as long as the jury can hear you, that'll be fine. Thank you.
That is correct, Your Honor.
Go right ahead.
Good afternoon. If you could please state both your first and last name and spell both for the record, please.
My first name is Corey, C-O-R-I. My last name is Breslauer, B-R-E-S-L-A-U-E-R.
What do you do for a living?
I'm the Deputy Medical Examiner at the Dane County Medical Examiner's Office.
And that means you're an MD?
That is correct.
And you obviously went through some substantial training in order to become a deputy medical examiner.
That is correct.
I'm going to approach you now with Exhibit 363. showing you what has been marked as Exhibit 363. Is this your curriculum vitae?
This is.
At this point, I would move Exhibit 363 into evidence.
No objection.
It is received.
So, doctor, where did you go to medical school?
I went to medical school at the University of Arizona College of Medicine in Phoenix, Arizona.
And then did you do a residency?
I did a residency in anatomic and clinical pathology at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill.
And what is pathology?
Pathology is a study of medicine that basically covers the effects of injury and disease on the body.
And are you board certified in any area?
I am board certified in anatomic pathology and in forensic pathology.
Now, what does it mean to be board certified?
Board certification means that I underwent an approved training program in the field that I'm certified in, and then I took a qualifying exam following that training and passed that exam.
And these are pretty extensive, several day long exams.
That is correct.
And have you worked as a medical examiner at any location outside of the Dane County office?
I worked as a local medical examiner at the North Carolina office of the chief medical examiner in Raleigh, North Carolina.
And many careers like teachers, lawyers, have to go through continuing education. Is that something that doctors also have to go through?
Yes, it is.
And so you've attended trainings throughout your career as well?
Yes, the American Board of Pathology requires that I maintain my certification.
And you got involved in this investigation on July 8th of 2021, is that correct?
I believe so. I don't have my report in front of me.
Okay, well, fair enough. That's exactly what I was getting to.
Yes.
And you did write an official report in this case, is that fair?
I did.
And there was a typo in your first report, so you wrote, there's an amended report that basically eliminates one word.
The amended report reflects a correction of one typographical error.
I'm going to show you what has been marked as Exhibit 364. Is this your amended report in this case?
This is my amended report with the triage notes from our office attached to the front.
All right, I would move Exhibit 364 into evidence at this time.
No objection.
It is received.
And also in preparation for testifying, as a team, we put together a PowerPoint, which I'm going to present in booklet form because of the sensitive nature of the photos. But is that true?
Yes.
And that is marked as Exhibit 366. And I just ask that you page through Exhibit 366 and make sure that that is the presentation that was put together.
This is the presentation.
And does that presentation, for the most part, it is just photos of the autopsy that you performed in this case?
That is correct.
Okay. At this time, I would move Exhibit 366 into evidence. And I also have 365, which is a digital copy, just for the record.
No objection.
Or both are accepted into evidence.
And doctor, throughout the questioning, obviously, I'm going to have you looking at Exhibit 366. But if you also need to look at your report 364, that is fine. Just maybe note on the record when you were doing so and what pages.
Yes.
Just so we have a complete record here.
As the booklets are being distributed to the jury, I'll remind you that you should only turn pages when the witness is discussing the next page within the pamphlet. Obviously, you can turn back at any point. And again, we will advise you that observing these images is an important role as a juror, but studying these images is up to you personally as to the necessity that you feel to do so during the course of the testimony. Go ahead.
And doctor, obviously you've worked as a medical examiner in various roles for several years, but is it fair to say you've performed hundreds of autopsies?
Yes, that is fair.
Okay. Obviously you don't remember them all individually, thus you write reports.
That's correct.
Okay. So anytime you need to refer to your report, that is just fine. So how did you become involved in this case? Did you actually go to the scene on Irwin Road where the torso was found?
I did go to the scene where the torso was found. The cases are brought to the office's attention by contacting our office. They first get triaged through our investigators who gather initial information, after which we are made aware of the scene, the suspicious nature, whether or not our presence is requested. I was notified that there was a scene, potentially suspicious scene, that my presence was requested at, and I then arrived at the scene with the investigator.
And why do medical examiners go to scenes?
Medical examiners goes to scenes because there is information that we can gather, circumstantial information based off of the position of the body, the environment that the body is found, and because my specialty is assessing the circumstances and the injuries that are found on the body, I'm able to assimilate all of that information.
So what did you do when you went to the Irwin Road address? What did you just look around, take pictures, something else?
Once the scene was assessed to be safe for us to enter, we approached where the body was located. We looked at the environment that the body was in, and then photographs were taken at my direction by the investigator.
Then what did you do next?
So the body was underneath a considerable amount of brush and debris, and the layers of that brush and debris were removed, again, at my direction. And we then assessed the body as it was in its position.
And in all fairness, the brush and debris was kind of slowly removed, so each little process could be photographed. Is that
That's
fair?
correct.
Okay. At some point, was the torso removed and transferred back to your medical office?
It was under my direction.
Okay. And what does that mean, under your direction? Is there a certain procedure that you guys use?
There is. Once we look at the body as it is, we roll the body and look at all the sides. We photograph the body in multiple angles, and we then wrap the body in an evidence sheet. Usually, if the body is intact, we will bag the hands and the feet to protect evidence that may be there. In this case, there were no limbs for us to bag separately, but we did wrap the body in a sheet, placed it into a clean body bag, and then we transported it back to our office for further examination.
And back at your office, what, if any, sort of examination do you perform?
So back at the office, we have the resources, the lighting, and the tools available to perform a complete examination on the body, on the outside and the inside. We begin with an external exam where we look at the surfaces and the injuries and the markings of the body and document everything that we see with our eyes. Following that, and as well as collection of any evidence that we see. Following that, we then open the body and we examine the internal organs and any injuries that we see on the inside of the body and collect any specimens that we may need to evaluate later.
Do you x-ray the body?
We do.
And did that x-ray in this case help with identification?
It did.
And who was this torso? Who did you identify as it belonging to? Or as it being?
Right. So we often evaluate bodies that come in without an identity, and so often they will come with a presumed identity. In this case, we were told that the presumed identity of the body was Bart Halderson. We received imaging x-rays of Bart Halderson that were taken while he was alive, and we then compared those to the x-rays that we took of the body that we had in our office, and I found multiple points of concordance that identified this body scientifically as Bart Halderson.
And did you folks also collect DNA from the torso?
We did.
I am going to show you what has been marked as Exhibit 372. And that's called a DNA spot card, is that correct?
That is correct.
And this appears to be the evidence envelope for Bart B. Halderson's DNA spot card.
That is correct.
And did you collect that DNA, or did somebody from the sheriff's office?
This would have been either myself or my team with my autopsy tech.
Okay. I move Exhibit 372 into evidence at this time.
No objection.
It is received.
Okay. Doctor, why don't we move on to page 2?
Folks, I want to tell you two things. If you look at the cover page, you'll see a small numeral in the bottom right-hand corner. All of the pages have those, and they're numbered. So if you were to lose your place, you could find out the next page by searching out those numbers in that corner. Unlike the presentations last week, this one doesn't work its way slowly into the process. I just wanted to alert you to that. Go ahead, Attorney Raymond.
That's correct. Doctor, could you please describe page 2 to the jury?
Page 2 is one part of a 3-part overall photograph of the torso, showing the lower half or inferior part.
And there's 2 circles on the right-hand side of this slide or this photo. What are those circles highlighting?
The circles on the right are highlighting the severed femurs of the body. Basically, the body was dismembered with the lower limbs removed, and the circles show the terminal ends of the femur bones.
And then there's a circle on the left side. What is the circle on the left side of page 2 highlighting?
The circle on the left side of page 2 shows a gunshot wound.
Moving on to page 3. Could you please describe page 3 for the jury?
Page 3 is part 2 of a 3-panel overall, showing the middle part of the body.
Okay. And a circle there again highlighting a gunshot wound?
That is correct. It is the same wound that is highlighted in the previous photograph.
And do you know yet in this part of your autopsy if that's an entrance wound or an exit wound?
Yes, this is an exit wound.
An exit wound.
Yes.
All right. So, and we'll get more into that. Does that mean, though, that for lack of a better term, Mr. Halderson was shot in the back?
That is correct.
Moving on to page 4. What does page 4 show?
Page 4 is part 3 of a 3-panel overall, showing the front half of the torso.
Okay. And again, there's 3 circles on the left side of that slide. Would you explain what those 3 circles are highlighting?
Yes, so the circles on the top and the bottom highlight the severed upper extremities, and the terminal ends of the humeral bones. The circle on the left in the middle, in between those two, shows the neck or the base of the neck where the head has been severed.
All right. Let's turn to slide 5. How would you describe slide 5 for the jury?
Slide 5 shows the posterior or back side of the torso. For orientation, the head, or where the head would be on the left side, and the feet would be on the right side.
Okay. How would you describe what the red circle is highlighting on the rightmost side?
The right circle is circling what I have labeled as gunshot wound number 1. It is an entrance gunshot wound.
Okay. And how would you describe the circle on the more left side?
The left side is also a gunshot entrance wound, which I describe as gunshot wound number 2.
And doctor, how can you tell if a wound is an entrance wound or an exit wound?
There are characteristics which support wounds being either entrance wounds or exit wounds. In place, an entrance wound typically has a round shape and an abrasion collar where the bullet abrades the skin as it enters the body. We can also find, depending on the range of fire, if the gun was fired at a close range to the body, we can sometimes find evidence of burned and unburned gunpowder particles, soot, and things like this.
Okay. Let's move on to slide 6. What is slide 6 showing?
Slide 6 is a closer view of the left-sided or superior or closer to the head gunshot entrance wound from the previous slide.
Okay. And were you able to, based on the characteristics, look at the surrounding area under a microscope?
That is correct.
And when you look at a wound or an entrance wound or whatever sort of wound under a microscope, what are you looking for?
So sometimes we can see soot with our eyes without any assistance because there's a black residue. However, in this case, there was decompositional artifact that obscured and discolored the areas. So what I did was I sampled 4 areas from each wound and looked at it under the microscope. And what that allowed me to see was microscopic evidence of soot that I could not see without the assistance of a microscope.
And based on, are you able to make any determinations based on amount of soot or whether soot is present or not?
I can comment on whether it was present or not in the pieces of tissue that I submitted. So I see a 2-dimensional plane of cells under the microscope, and in those pieces that I sampled, if it is present, then I can see that it's there. It appears as black granular debris deposited within the dermis, which is the second layer underneath the very surface of the skin. And if I don't see it, it does not necessarily mean it is not present at all. It only means that it was not present in the tissue that I sampled.
And what is the relationship between how far away a gun is from a person's skin and soot?
Typically, you're expecting a contact range gunshot if soot is seen.
All right, so if there's soot present,
within inches.
That means within, I'm sorry.
Inches.
Inches, okay. And if soot is not present, what, if anything, does that tell you about the gun range in relationship to the victim's skin?
Yes, so that it can say a couple of things. It can say, if there is no soot, it can say that the range of fire was farther away and that there was too much distance for soot to make it to the body. It can also say that something could have been in the way that could have obstructed soot from making it to the body. So there could have been layers of clothing or a wall or a door or something obstructing soot making it to the body.
And when you looked at the wound that is pictured in slide 6, what, if any, evidence did you find of soot?
I did not find a microscopic evidence of soot in this injury.
So what range do you put for this wound?
For this, I have indeterminate range because I do not have characteristics that can tell me what the range is.
So basically that means it could be feet instead of inches. Is that a fair
It is.
way to say it?
It is. It means I do not know the range.
Okay. I'm going to turn to slide 7. What is pictured on slide 7?
Slide 7 is a metal fragment that was found in the wound track representing a fragment of projectile.
Okay. And during this autopsy, projectile fragments were turned over to the Dane County Sheriff's Office, is right?
Yes, that is correct.
But then you came across one later during the process of examining the bones.
Yes, so due to the sensitive nature of this case, our office retained the body in our cooler. I then re-examined the body later on in order to fully understand the wound tracts. Upon that second exam is when I found the additional fragment.
I'm going to show you Exhibit 555. And when you found that additional fragment, did you turn it over to the Sheriff's Office as well?
I did.
Okay. And on Exhibit 555, does that appear to be the label for the metal fragment that you turned over to Tim Blank from the Sheriff's Office?
Yes.
I'd move Exhibit 555 into evidence at this time.
No objection.
Thank you, it is received.
All right. Turning now to slide 8. Could you please describe slide 8 for the jury?
Slide 8 represents, it's a similar photograph, but it highlights a different gunshot entrance wound.
Okay. The one that's more on the right or lower in the back.
That is correct. It is closer to the feet than the entrance wound that was previously discussed.
Okay. And flipping to slide 9.
Slide 9 is a close-up photograph of the entrance wound that was in the previous slide on slide 8.
And were you able to look microscopically for soot on this wound?
I did.
And this is wound number 1 in your report, I believe.
That is correct.
And were you able to determine what range or what distance the gun was from the skin based upon the microscopic findings?
There were granular particles within the dermis on microscopy of the tissue I submitted here that were consistent with soot. Therefore, I assessed that as a contact range gunshot entrance wound.
So there was soot on the skin.
Yes,
So contact range.
correct.
And again, going from back to front.
Correct.
Slide 10.
Slide 10 shows the anterior or front surface of the body, and a gunshot exit wound is highlighted.
And is that the exit wound from shot 1 or shot 2?
That is the exit wound from gunshot wound number 1, the contact range gunshot wound.
All right. All right, and let's move to slide 11, please.
Slide 11 demonstrates a close-up of the slide 10,
Okay.
the exit gunshot wound from gunshot wound number 1.
And the shape there is just kind of showing that with exit wounds, you can't usually put them back perfectly together like you can an entrance wound.
That is correct. As we discussed, the characteristics of gunshot wounds that allow me to assess whether or not they are entrance or exit. Exit wounds tend to be irregular, and they tend to be able to reapproximate. And this is just showing that irregular margin of the exit wound on the anterior surface.
Slide number 12. What is slide number 12 highlighting?
Slide number 12 also shows an anterior version of the torso, and it is highlighting hemorrhage at the neck.
Okay. And there's like a ruler sticker there.
Yes.
What are you measuring there?
We use a label that has a scale on it that puts our unique identification number so that every photograph that we take has that unique identification number, and that scale allows us to measure whatever is in the field that we are photographing.
And is this hemorrhage from the mutilation or is this hemorrhage from a bullet?
The hemorrhage
Trajectory.
is surrounding the gunshot wounds.
Okay. And slide 13, please.
Slide 13 shows the base of the neck around the area of the right shoulder, and it is a ragged defect that is circled in the center right above that scale, and it represents a possible entry or exit for a third gunshot wound.
So there are at least 2 gunshot wounds, 1 and 2 that we discussed, and a possible third here.
Correct. We discussed 2 gunshot wounds, and then this is a third.
And were you able to look microscopically at this third gunshot wound?
I'm going to refer to my report.
Sure.
So on page 8 of 10, I have the descriptions of my histologic slides, and I submitted skin tissue only from the entrances and the exit previously discussed. I did not submit skin from this.
And is that partly because of the jagged nature, and it seems like there's more disruption to the skin?
That is correct. Additionally, the bullet material that was found directly underneath it, it's going to be impossible to tell if that represents the entirety of the wound track or if there is tissue missing because of the proximity to the severed head.
Thank you. Exhibit 14, could you tell us what that slide exhibits?
Slide 14 is a portion of our posterior soft tissue dissection showing hemorrhage surrounding where I recovered the bullet fragments from the neck.
And then slide 15.
Slide 15 is jacket fragments and lead core fragments that were recovered from the neck.
Sorry, what was the second thing you said after jacket fragments?
So there's more than one part of a bullet. So there's the lead core of a bullet, and then there's the jacket that covers the bullet, and both are represented here.
It was the word lead I missed. Thank you.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Doctor, obviously the legs, the arms, and the head were removed from this torso. Is there any can you make any determination whether that disfigurement or dismemberment occurred before or after Bart Halderson died?
So one thing that helps us determine whether or not an injury occurred before or after death is the presence or absence of a vital reaction or hemorrhage. So we've been talking about me finding hemorrhage in areas of injury. In the areas where the gunshot entrances were, there was hemorrhage around it, indicating that the heart was beating when the individual was shot. Where I recovered bullet fragments, there was hemorrhage or vital reaction surrounding that area. However, in the areas surrounding the dismembered limbs, or the head, the upper extremities, and the lower extremities, there were injuries, but I did not appreciate this vital reaction. I did not appreciate hemorrhage in the same way that I appreciated around the other injuries.
So the mutilation occurred after death?
That is correct.
Doctor, did you determine a cause of death for Bart Halderson?
I did.
And what was that cause of death?
As written on page 2 of my report, I determined the cause of death was gunshot wounds of the torso.
And did you determine a manner of death?
I did.
And what was the manner of death for Bart Halderson?
As I'm reading from page 2 of my report, I assessed that the manner of death was homicide.
Counsel, I believe page 16 of the booklet hasn't been discussed. And if you don't want to publish that page, that's fine, but I don't think I heard any testimony about that.
Oh, I'm sorry. My pages were just sticking together. I apologize, everyone. Doctor, could you look at page 16?
Yes.
What does 16 show?
Page 16 is also a representation of the posterior or back side of the torso around the area of the hip or the right hip or the flank. This represents a small ligature furrow. When the body was found at the scene, there was a length of rope that was encircling the body, and this was the area corresponding to where the rope was likely rubbing against the body.
So that's a wound from the rope.
That's correct.
And do you know of the gunshot wounds? Do you know, were both of them fatal? Was just one of them fatal or something else?
I would say that they were all fatal.
No further questions.
Cross-examination.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
Let's just start there with the 3 gunshot wounds. There's no way for you to tell which happened first, second, or third, correct?
That is correct. So when I was talking about the vital reaction or the hemorrhage, I can say that something happened before or after someone died, but with rare exceptions, am I able to say the order that one happened over the other.
And in your report, you noted, I think you used the words, at least 3 gunshot wounds. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And why use the phrase at least?
So in this case, I have missing tissue. I have missing upper extremities, lower extremities, and a missing head. So in the portion of the remains that I received, there were 3 gunshot wounds, evidence of 3 gunshot wounds, but I cannot say whether or not that there are additional gunshot wounds that could be in tissue that is absent or that I don't have the ability to evaluate.
And because on the 3 you were able to evaluate, you did see evidence of this vital reaction, is it fair to say it's your opinion that the person was alive when these gunshot wounds happened?
Yes.
And if there were other gunshot wounds to other extremities that you weren't able to examine, you wouldn't be able to tell if those were the same, having vital reaction, or not having a vital reaction, obviously.
If the remains are not available, I cannot tell.
Now, you did testify that the dismemberment happened post-mortem because there was no vital reaction, correct?
Correct.
Are you able to say how long after the person died that the dismemberment happened?
Not with any certainty or with very much accuracy. There are estimations I could make based off of the decomposition that I saw. I can say that my findings are consistent with the circumstances that were given to me, but that's about as far as I could comfortably say.
Now, on page 2 of the report, when you talk about manner of death, you'd already testified that it was ruled homicide, but then there's a bracket where you say shot by other, parentheses S, with unknown firearm. So other or others, there's nothing about your examination that can tell you how many people might have been involved in shooting this person, correct?
That is correct. Because there is more than one gunshot wound, and because I was not present, I cannot say whether or not those were inflicted by one or more firearms.
You can say it wasn't this person self-inflicting these wounds.
Yes.
And again, just so we're clear, unknown firearm, there's nothing about your examination that could tell you what firearm caused these shots, correct?
Correct. The characteristics of the injuries are not such that I can tell a caliber or a type of firearm.
Thank you, that's all I have.
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor.
May the doctor be excused.
They may.
I'll take your report. I think that's still there. Anything else that is with you? Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
And we should collect the booklets that were utilized with the witness. Let me inquire, Attorney Raymond, who's next in the witness list? Nature of the next testimony and the length of time. We've been here an hour, but it's also been an hour that was intense. So let's go ahead and take a break at this point for convenience, and we'll come back in 10 minutes and resume with the next witness. Thank you.
All rise for the jury.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Langer. I am the digital content manager at channel3000.com. As you just heard there, they're going to take their mid-afternoon break here in day 6 of the Chandler Halderson trial. About a 10-minute break or so not too long. But the next witness is supposed to take a while, so they just said that it's probably best to take the break right now. Also, jurors just getting through listening to some pretty taxing testimony and taxing images. So, of course, we can't see what the jurors were seeing. The prosecutors handed out booklets of the images from the autopsy of Bart Halderson. So the jurors were the ones paging through some of the really intense imagery there of the autopsy of the remains of Bart that were found at that farm in Cottage Grove. Of course, as we know, it was a severed torso, so there were no arms, no legs, and no head associated. So definitely it's very hard to look at, and this testimony from the medical examiner really kind of getting into some more very intense details of what was found. So to kind of recap, the medical examiner was called out to that property on July 8th once the remains were found. They asked that the remains be taken back to their office so they could do a full examination. They did a full external exam and an internal exam too, and just kind of running through what they found. The body was severed at the femurs, they said. Also multiple gunshot wounds, at least one. The first one that they noticed indicated that Bart was shot in the back. And based on some of the microscopic work that they did, they found that it was a very close range, almost a contact range shot to the back. That was one of the shots discovered. There were also 2 other gunshots discovered in the torso based on the number of exit wounds that were found. They said that they could not determine which shot came first, but there was at least the one shot in the back, another one kind of up towards the neck area as well. As part of that, too, they took some x-rays of the torso that they had, and that's how they were able to determine that it was Bart Halderson. They were able to get previous x-rays of Bart when he was alive and sort of match up that x-ray with the torso that they had just taken, and they were able to find several features that were pretty distinguishing and led to the positive identification there. So that's how they were able to determine it was Bart Halderson, even with just it being a torso. They said they also took some DNA there as well. Also, as part of the report, the medical examiner's office, if you're not familiar with how they work, they issue a cause of death and a manner of death as well. So in this particular case, it was ruled that Bart was shot to death, and the manner of death was ruled a homicide. So that's where then the homicide charges come in for Chandler Halderson. Of course, once it was ID'd and he was arrested, that's what he was charged with. So again, a closer look at the report there found that they determined that Bart was shot while he was still breathing, but he was dismembered after he was already dead. They were able to tell that based on the level of hemorrhaging and things like that at those locations. So again, some pretty very detailed and very tough to listen to details on the autopsy of Bart Halderson, and that's without us even seeing the images. So you can probably imagine what the jurors experienced there over the last hour or so of this testimony, and why the judge thought it was a good idea to maybe give them 10 minutes or so to kind of recollect themselves and before they move on to the rest of the afternoon. If you're just joining us now and you missed this morning, we have a link to a recap of what happened this morning posted in the comments here. You can also go to that URL that's in the description of these live streams, channel3000.com/Halderson. You'll get all the updates there as well. But basically what we had heard from this morning were some of the neighbors who had testified that on the evening of July 1st, they had smelled something kind of odd in the air. They thought they smelled wood burning. Before that smell sort of just changed pretty quickly. They said over the course of a few minutes there, it started to smell like somebody was barbecuing pork or roasting pork. And it was a very pungent smell as what they described. We later learned from a fire expert, a person with the state Department of Justice whose job is to investigate these fires, and he said oftentimes when human flesh is burned and after it's burned, it's a very similar smell to a pork barbecue. So that kind of led into the prosecution's assertion that Chandler Halderson may have tried to get rid of some of his parents' remains in the family fireplace. We also saw testimony from another neighbor who had security camera footage showing one side of the Halderson home, and through the early morning hours of the night and into the early morning of July 2nd, you could see a flickering light in the Halderson home. Deputies believe that was a fire in the fireplace. They did a lot of video analysis and did some experiments to recreate things, and they were able to determine that that light was coming from the same room that had the family room fireplace. So they were able to tell that they believe a fire was burning there for much of the night. The video that they played in court was about 35 minutes long of sped up security footage, and it stretched from about 12:18 all the way up until about 4:30 in the morning. So several hours of that fireplace going on a hot July night. So investigators thought that was noteworthy as well. So a lot to go through so far today, sort of like yesterday where we saw all that physical evidence kind of coming into play. Today we saw another long video. We saw how investigators also looked kind of deeper into that fireplace, and how those experts said that when they were there too, they thought they smelled the same pork smell that the neighbors were smelling, and they found some grease on a chain in the fireplace, and they sifted through the ashes of the fireplace and found more bone fragments there as well. So prosecutors sort of piecing all of this together now as they continue to build their case, now that we're in day 6 of the trial here, and really maybe only about halfway through the prosecution's case. They said that they could take up to 3 weeks to do this. So plenty more still to get to as we get through this break. And a reminder, we'll have this all for you over at channel3000.com. So if you miss anything, you have to step away for a few minutes, or you miss a day, all of it's going to be recapped at that page on channel3000.com, so you can go there for the updates. We're going to step away for a few minutes here while the break continues, but we will be back once the jury is back in the courtroom. Thanks for watching.
Thank you. Please be seated. And the state will call the next witness, please.
I call Denise Jones from the Wisconsin State Crime Lab.
You solemnly swear affirm the testimony you're about to give in this matter is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Yes.
Good afternoon. I've had a discussion with every witness about whether they are willing to or believe they can safely and responsibly testify without a mask, but I've not ordered anyone to do so. Is it your preference to remain masked at this time, or could you testify without?
I'd prefer to have it on.
Very good. Then if you can pull the microphone really close, because it does have a tendency to muffle, and we'll make sure that we can hear you and that the jury can hear you. Thank you. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. Could you please state and spell your name for the court?
Denise Jones, DENISEJONES.
And what do you do for a living?
I'm a senior forensic scientist in the DNA analysis unit at the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory in Madison.
How long have you been employed by the Wisconsin State Crime Lab?
14 and a half years.
What are your duties and responsibilities there?
I examine evidence for the presence of biological stains, such as blood, semen, and saliva. I extract DNA from those stains and make comparisons to known individuals. I write reports on my findings, and I testify in court if necessary.
Could you tell us about your educational background?
I received my Bachelor's of Science in Biology from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point in 2001, and I received my Master's of Science in Bacteriology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2004.
Have you received any specialized training in the field of serology, DNA, statistics, things of that sort?
Yes, I received 9 months of training on DNA analysis prior to doing casework. I also received training on statistics and star mix for about 2 months prior to doing it to casework. I'm required to take 8 hours of continuing education every year.
Have you, prior to today and previously, have you testified as an expert in court?
Yes, this is my 48th time.
Can you tell us, we'll talk a little bit about the laboratory, the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory. Is that an accredited lab?
Yes, it is.
And what does that mean?
It means we meet accurate and reliable testing.
Sure. Do you and your lab undergo any sort of proficiency testing?
Yes, I am required to undergo 2 proficiency tests a year.
What do those consist of?
It's samples that we would see in casework and to see if we can accurately and reliably do DNA analysis.
What is DNA?
DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It's the DNA we inherit from our parents. We inherit 50% from our fathers and 50% from our mothers, and it codes for all structure and function in our body. And DNA is found in every cell in the body except for red blood cells. So it's found in skin cells, white blood cells, and sperm cells.
How is DNA used in forensic science?
So most of our DNA is similar person to person, but there are specific areas that distinguish us from others. And it's those areas that we look at in DNA in forensics. Everyone will have differences except identical siblings. We look at 23 of these genetic markers and one that's specific for gender.
Sure. You said everyone will have different DNA other than identical siblings?
That's correct.
Can you tell us how DNA testing is conducted at the laboratory?
Can you be a little bit more specific?
Sure. What's the steps for conducting DNA testing when you're at the crime lab?
So we have multiple steps in the DNA analysis process. We have what's called extraction, which we are extracting the DNA from the sample or opening up the cell to get the DNA. We have quantitation, which allows us to determine how much DNA is in a sample, which will allow us to know whether or not we need to go on for further testing. And currently our kits, we can determine how much human DNA is present, how much male DNA is present, and whether or not we can detect degradation or inhibition in the sample.
Are these methods of testing and typing generally accepted by the scientific community?
Yes.
And do the majority of forensic scientists use these methods that you use?
Yes.
Are there multiple levels of review conducted to ensure that the correct procedures are followed in each case?
Yes, we have what's called technical review, which another qualified analyst also reviews the case file and report and looks to see that I followed our procedure manual correctly for interpretation, statistics, and notes.
I'm showing you it's been marked in this case as exhibit number 380. This will just be brief, but can you tell me what that is?
That's a copy of my statement of qualifications.
And does that list your training and education in this field, making you qualified to comment on some of the matters you're going to comment on today?
Yes.
I'll move 380 into evidence.
No objection.
Thank you. It is received.
At times over the past year, since July of this year, have you been asked to become involved at various times into an investigation into a homicide that occurred over in Windsor involving some people with the names of Bart Halderson, Krista Halderson, Chandler Halderson?
Yes.
And have you produced numerous reports related to your analysis of separate items that have been submitted to you over that course of time?
Yes, I believe 4 reports.
Okay. Can I briefly ask you, who makes the decision to submit items to the crime lab?
That's up to the agency to submit, but then we also have submission guidelines in place on certain types of cases of how many items we'll allow upon submission. But as long as we have a meeting with the agency, we may allow more.
Sure. In general, in most cases, what is that limit of items that can be submitted?
10 for homicides?
And was that far exceeded in this case?
Yes.
Okay. And you were, in fact, the one who had to do with the testing?
Yes.
Okay. I'm showing you what's been marked in this case. I'm going to show you all 4 exhibits at once, and then we'll go through them. Can you tell us what exhibit number 383 is, just briefly? And you might want to turn one page in.
This is my report dated July 29th. It has my signature on it.
And does that appear to be a true and accurate copy of your report?
Yes.
All right. I'll show you what's been marked in this case as exhibit number 417. Same question. Turn a page in, and let me know what that is.
This is my report dated September 1st, 2021.
And does that appear to be a true and accurate report, or a copy of the report on that date?
It appears to be.
Okay, I'll take that one from you. Showing you what's been marked as exhibit number 418. Same questions.
This is a report dated October 6th, 2021 that I authored.
And appear to be a true and accurate copy.
Yes.
And lastly, 560. Same questions.
This appears to be a report that I authored dated November 8th, 2021.
True and accurate copy.
Yes.
At this time, Judge, I'll move 417, 18, 383, and 560 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection.
They are all received.
And I'll move to publish.
You may publish.
Ms. Jones, in preparation for testifying today, in order to make this a more visually understandable experience for everyone, you understand that your report has been maybe cut apart and put into a PowerPoint for everyone to see?
Yes.
Okay. And so we'll start with, you were asked to perform a report, and you did write a report on July 29th, 2021. Was this your first report in this case?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And as I'm talking about each report, in fact, I'll just give you a copy, and you can go ahead and just let us know if you're referencing that report, okay? And I see you brought some materials with you. If you need to reference anything, you can just let us know that you need to refresh your recollection, and we'll let you go ahead and do that. Just so there's a clear record, we'll just say that out loud, even though it might be a tad awkward or not normal. We'll go through this one somewhat slowly so everyone can understand maybe how these reports take form. But the first section of your report, we talk about items examined. So what did you examine here?
I examined a dried blood standard reportedly from Bart Halderson, an electric toothbrush head reportedly used by Krista Halderson, and then some samples reportedly of human remains, K1 through K6, of differing body parts and then a buccal swab standard reportedly from Mr. Halderson.
Okay. And I'm going to show you a couple of these items, just so we're talking about the same thing. I'm going to show you what's been received into evidence already in this case. It's been labeled with the exhibit sticker 194, and it's labeled electric toothbrush head. We're not going to open it or anything, but do you see anything on there that indicates that item has been to the lab?
It has our yellow barcode label with the case number and the item number.
And the case number in this case is what?
M21-1575.
And what is an item number?
It's just the item that we give each item that comes into the lab.
Okay. So while the police may have labeled it with a letter or a number, and maybe in court we put a sticker on it with a different number, you have your own system and you put your own letter to it?
Yes.
Okay. And what letter is that?
Item I.
All right. Same question with the item labeled Mr. Halderson DNA spot card. What item is that?
That is M21-1575, item B.
For the record, we're talking about exhibit 372 and then 361. What item is that?
It's M21-1575, item N.
Okay. So these items come into the lab. Can you tell me just a bit, and we won't do this for each item, but when the police bring you out an item, how are they processed in? I imagine there's not just a mailbox out front, that there's some process for this.
They usually meet with an evidence specialist that will take inventory of all the items and then give them a receipt of their items. And then they create the case and all the item numbers in our LIMS system.
Okay. We'll go to the next slide. And here it says preparation for analysis. In your report, what does preparation for analysis mean?
It means when I took swabbings or cuttings from each of these items, I took a portion of that item, and so I'm sub-designating the cuttings or the swabbings that I took for each item. So on the left, we have the sample name, and in the middle is what the parent item is, and then we have the sub-designation of what I made of the cuttings or the swabbings I took from those items.
Okay. So if you take a swab of, say, item B, which is the Bart Halderson blood standard from the medical examiner office, you take a cotton swab and then you cut something off that swab?
Well, it was a blood standard given, so I just cut a portion of the dried blood standard, and then I sub-designated it as B1.
Okay. So some of the original remains?
Original blood that was given to me, yes.
Okay. And when we sub-designate something, and again, we'll go through this one a little bit more carefully, and I think everyone will get the hang of it in a second, but when we sub-designate something, is it always carry that same letter and then add usually either a number or a letter to it?
Either, depending on what the parent item is, so in this instance, there's item B, so that the sub-designation would be B1. And then for the portion cut from the left leg tissue, the item was K1, but the sub-designation I made was K1A.
Okay. After you prepare them for analysis, I imagine you do some sort of DNA isolation?
Yes, we called, this is the quantification results that we got from the items that I did the DNA extraction on. And this table just explains the results of those quantitation and whether or not they went on for further analysis.
Sure. So in item B1 and N1, and we'll just use B1 as an example here, meaning it was the blood standard. Here you indicate you found human DNA.
Right. When we do standard extractions, we typically go from extraction right into the amplification stage. We don't usually quantify these standards unless there's a necessity to do it.
Okay. And when in the further testing column, it says autosomal STR. What does that mean?
That's the amplification that we use to detect human or DNA profiles from.
When we go to K2A, K5A, and K6A, could you remind us again, based on the report, what were those items where it says, because here it says, of course, human DNA not detected. What were K2A, K5A, and K6A? What were those cuttings of?
K2A was a cutting of reported left thigh tissue, and then K5A and K6A were swabbings of the hollow area of the left and right thigh bones.
And I made this slide to maybe highlight that, again, going through this one more carefully for the jury. here you actually had portions of thigh tissue that you were not able to detect DNA on.
That's correct.
And as an analyst, is that something that can be explained, or do you have any comments on how possibly part of a cutting from a human thigh tissue, there was no DNA detectable on that?
The item received when I examined it did not really appear to have a lot of pink tissue. It was very whitish in color, and it had a distinct odor to it when examining it. So I knew I would probably have a difficult time of getting DNA recovered from that. Based on my experience, items like those are difficult to recover DNA from due to possible bacterial activity inhibiting the ability to recover DNA.
Okay, so sometimes bacterial activity or things being in the elements and subjected to that can have an impact on whether you can obtain the DNA? Yes. Okay, but you were able to identify or find DNA or detect DNA from K1A, which is of the same general items.
K1A was left leg tissue.
Okay. And so next you have some standards. So you have the dry blood standard from Bart Halderson, item B1, and then you have Mitchell Halderson, which you labeled as N1, and you have single source profile. What does the single source profile mean?
When we get the data after amplification and typing the DNA, we interpret the DNA, and we can determine whether the profile is from one contributor, which is a single source profile, or from more than one person, which is a mixture. And in this case, when I was doing the analysis of the data, both of these items appeared to be from single source individuals.
And when we look at the swabbing of the bristles on the electric toothbrush head, and that you say reportedly was used by Krista Halderson, what does that mean when you wrote single source female profile? Explain that.
So we have the ability in our amplification kit that has one area that we can determine gender. And in this case, females will have an XX and the male will have an XY. And when interpreting this profile, there was only the X for the gender, indicating it was a female single source profile.
Moving to the next portion, you start talking about this item K1A in which you were able to isolate or detect some DNA. Tell us what this section of your report means.
So the result is that I got a partial single source female profile, which means I didn't get a complete profile, but I got a pretty good profile from it. Out of the 23 markers that we do amplification on, I had 22 of them, and so that makes it a partial profile. And then I compared that partial profile to the swabbing, to the profile I got from the swabbing of the electric toothbrush head. And Krista Halderson was considered the source of that profile.
And understanding at that time, identifying Krista Halderson and her remains was important. Did you then use the buccal swab or the single source profile from their reported son, Mitchell, as well as what you knew to be Bart, to try to come to some sort of conclusions as well?
Yes, I did a paternity to determine whether or not those remains could also be the possible biological mother of Mitchell Halderson, knowing that Bart Halderson was the biological father. And it was at least 413 billion times more likely to observe the profile from Mitchell Halderson if the female profile detected from the left leg tissue is his biological mother than if it's a random unrelated female unrelated female is the mother.
Fair to say a good part of this report was simply determining the sources of the DNA. So you had Krista, Bart, Mitchell, and eventually you obtained Chandler Halderson's DNA, correct?
Yes.
You then wrote another report on September 1st, and I'll bring that one to you. That's labeled as exhibit number 417. Fair to say in this report, we start testing pieces of evidence, maybe the more traditional thing that folks might think about when they think of your job. We're talking about evidence that was collected.
Yes.
You examined a lot of items, correct?
Yes.
All right. I think you talked about examining here a garbage bin, item C2, a tarp that was sub-designated C2, meaning it was inside the garbage bin, I would imagine?
Oh, there were two items. The parent item was item C, that was a garbage bin and a tarp, and then we sub-designated the garbage bin and the tarp as two separate items.
Right. And then you labeled item D, scissors, item E, a broken saw blade, item F, a handsaw, item G, pruning shears, item L and M, both metal fragments, item P, a buckle swab from Chandler Halderson, and item S, a tarp that was recovered from a barn.
That's correct.
Okay. You did some blood testing on some of these items, correct?
Yes.
Let's talk about that. We heard yesterday from Deputy Leatherberry, who testified extensively about some of the blood tests he did. What does it mean when you write this in your report that you identified blood?
So when we identify blood in the lab, it's similar to, the testing is similar to a pregnancy test or a COVID test, where we're taking a little bit of the sample, adding some liquid reagent to it, and then adding it to a card. And for us to say blood was identified, we must see 2 lines. And if we only get 1 line, then blood was not detected on the item. And in this case, I had 2 positive lines when testing these items. So blood was identified on all of these items.
And Ms. Jones, if you wouldn't mind, would you step up here for a second, and we'll start talking first about item C that you sub-designated C1 and 2. I'll move the rest of them, but I can't move one of them. Could you take a look at this large item, this box that's in here? I believe this has been marked as an exhibit in this case, as exhibit number 14. And we don't have to open it, and I know there's reasons it's secured at this point. But could you let me know, do those stickers appear to be from the Wisconsin State Crime Lab and appear to be what you've labeled as item C, then sub-designated C1 and C2?
Yes.
Okay. You can take a seat again. In the garbage bin, item C1, you indicate you were able to identify blood. Do you recall where you were able to identify blood in the garbage bin?
Can I refer to my notes?
You can. Just let us know when you've refreshed your recollection.
I tested a swab that was from a stain near where the tape was inside the garbage bin.
And that was positive for blood?
Yes.
And then as to the tarp that's inside item C2, same question. Was that a swab of one of the stains on the tarp?
Both of them were, yes.
So item C2, and then I promised you that I'd carry the rest. This, I think, has been identified and perhaps colloquially called the barn tarp, tarp purportedly recovered from a barn in the Irwin Road property. Does that appear to have your lab sticker on it?
Yes, it's M21-1575, item S.
Okay, excellent. And we won't open this, and I understand why. But on this, you were able to identify blood as well?
Yes.
And was that on staining that you were able to observe?
Yes.
The detective's actually going to assist me for a little bit because we're going to maybe look at some of these items. Next, we're going to talk about item D, which is the scissors, which has been marked in this case as exhibit number 142. So the detective actually just approached you with that, if that's okay. Same question, is that the item, those scissors that you were able to look at the crime lab?
It has our designation of M21-1575, item D.
Okay, and we don't have to open that right now. We can actually probably just sit it right there because we're going to come back to it. But on the scissors, were you able to detect blood?
Yes.
And do you know where?
Can I refer to my notes?
Yes, just let us know when you've refreshed your memory.
I identified blood on the blade of the scissors.
Next, we're going to talk about the broken saw blade. I believe that's been received into evidence as exhibit number 141. We'll have the detective approach you with it. If you could look at that, make sure your lab sticker's on there, and we'll leave it with the scissors. It
appears to have our barcode M21-1575, item E on it.
Okay, For everyone's reference, at Exhibit 141, I believe broken saw blade testified to being recovered at the Irwin Road property. Were you able to detect blood on that saw blade?
Yes.
And where on the blade? Or was it just a swab of the blade in general?
It was the teeth of the blade.
Okay. Next, item F. We're just going to move that up there. This is I believe, received into evidence in this case as exhibit number 140, an All-Way brand handsaw.
Yes, it has our barcode label on it, M211575, item F.
And were you able to detect blood on that item?
Yes,
And do you know where?
on the blade.
And next, we're going to look at item G, same process. I appreciate the detective helping us out. If you could just confirm the lab stickers on there.
Yes, it has our barcode M211575, item G.
Okay. Are you always able to conduct a blood test on samples you receive?
Not always.
In what situations are you not?
Depending on how much staining is on an item, if there's very little staining on it, it's up to the analyst, maybe in discussion with the agency or on their own, to only go on for DNA analysis because there won't be enough to test for blood and do DNA, because we're taking a portion of that stain to do the screening test for blood. There might not be enough to do DNA analysis. So for us, it's more important to get a DNA profile from that than maybe doing screening on it.
In this specific case, did you work in conjunction with detectives and investigators, including Deputy Leatherberry, regarding items being submitted to the lab?
Yes,
Are you aware that sometimes he was performing tests to detect blood or human blood himself?
yes,
And if those situations came up or arose regarding a very limited amount and he had already performed a test, there'd be a discussion about maybe it being more important to do DNA analysis on your part?
yes,
Okay. You prepared these items for analysis, and we don't have to explain it again, but essentially you took swabs and there's some cuttings of those swabs, correct?
yes,
And you're able to do some analysis. So in each one, you're able to figure out if there's human DNA present, perhaps male DNA present, and then decide whether there's further testing that you can do.
yes.
Okay. And let's just take an example of a couple different, there's 3 different ways you've responded here. Item C1, B1, which was a portion of the swab cut from the inside lip of the garbage bin. Here it says human DNA present, male DNA present, but not selected for further testing. Can you tell us why?
Like I was explaining quantitation, our kit has the ability to detect human and male DNA, but we also have the ability to determine whether or not the sample has inhibition or degradation. And in this case, this sample had a very high degradation rate. And if this went on for further analysis, I would likely not get something interpretable for DNA. And there were plenty of other items that were going on for further testing. So this one was not selected.
Okay. The next possible result in the further testing column is for most of them, you write autosomal STR. What does that mean?
That means it went on to amplification, which is the DNA making copies of itself, and then going on for typing, which is taking that amplified DNA to detect a profile.
And the other option here is we see for item C2, I1, and S3A, you write unsuitable. What does unsuitable mean, and why is that different than not selected?
So in the human DNA column, I have limited human DNA, and I also have limited male DNA. And based on those results, they were below our threshold for samples to go on for further analysis. So these samples were not taken for further analysis, so no DNA profile was developed from these items.
Okay. The next item we're going to look at is, and I'll have the detective, if he wants to grab Mr. Halderson's buckle, and I'll approach you with that. But you had, from your July 29th report, you had some standards, meaning you had the single source profile of Bart Halderson and Mitchell Halderson.
Yes,
Okay. And you, based on the toothbrush head and your analysis, you believed you had Krista Halderson.
yes,
Okay. And in this report, September 1st, you were provided a buccal swab purportedly obtained from Chandler Halderson.
yes.
Judge, can we approach real quick?
Yes.
And I know we've looked at the other swabs previously, or the source profiles, but could you tell me, I'm showing you it's been marked as exhibit number 360. Could you tell me what that is?
That's the crime lab's item designation M211575, item P.
And what does this appear to be to you?
A buccal swab standard from Chandler Halderson.
Okay. At that point, you did some analysis on all of these items using those source profiles. Is that correct?
I made comparisons from the buccal swab standards to the evidence profiles developed.
Okay. And we're going to talk about those. Why are some of these grouped up in maybe one major result and some of them separated out individually?
This one was grouped together because it was the same male profile was detected from all of these items. So we like to group them together to kind of condense the report so it's not even longer than it already is.
Okay. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And so I'm going to show you some items, but let's start with here you say the swabbings from the stains. I think you testified there was blood on item C2, and there were some sub-designations there, D1, G1, and H1. What do those sub-designations mean again?
They're just different areas of the tarps that I swabbed, and then the cuttings that I took from those swabs that I took from the tarp.
And what was your conclusion related to the stains on that tarp that was found in the garbage cans, at least the swabs C2D1, C2G1, and C2H1?
They were single source male profiles from the same individual.
And who was that individual?
Bart Halderson was the source.
Is there any numerical value attached to when you say someone is the source?
For us to consider someone the source, the profile that the stat that we calculate, the profile has to be rarer than 1 in 7 trillion individuals, which is 1,000 times the world's population.
Okay. And here you say Krista, Mitchell, and Chandler are excluded. What does it mean for someone to be excluded?
They are not the source of that profile.
Okay. And the last line, additional possible trace alleles were detected, and it goes on. What does that line mean?
It means when I was analyzing the data from items F2 and L1, there were a couple minor types seen that I couldn't really say anything about. They could be just non-true peaks or artifacts from the amplification project. So they're trace alleles, and I'm not making any conclusions on those.
Okay, excellent. And the next item that's in this grouping is the swabbing of the staining. I think you've already testified about on the teeth blade of the handsaw, item F2.
Yes.
Okay, and I'm going to have the detective who's masked and gloved up with clean gloves, I would imagine, remove F2 from the box and just display to the jury, so we're recalling the same item. And first, I'll have the analyst look at that. Is that, in fact, the item that we're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. And I'll have the detective just remove that, and I'll ask you some questions about it. and I'll have him walk in front of the jury, and I'll ask you a couple of questions. What was your conclusion related to the swabbing of the staining on that saw, and I think it's been testified, purportedly recovered at the Irwin Road property?
It was a single source mail profile.
And who was that profile?
Bart Halderson was the source of that profile.
And that numerical value you gave previously, same answer for this one?
Yes.
So I'll ask the detective to re-glove at this point. The next item we'll talk about, and just to make sure we're all looking at the same thing, we'll remove it again. You swabbed the stains on the clippers, the ends of the pruning shears, which was item G3?
Yes.
Okay. All right, and first we'll show you the box. Is that in fact the item that we're discussing?
Yes.
All right, and I'll have the detective display it to the jury while I ask you the question. Item G3, what were your conclusions as to that item?
It was a single source mail profile, and Bart Halderson was the source of that profile.
Okay, we'll return that item to the box. Next, there are two items, and as the detective gets ready, L1 and M1, you list them as metal fragments, but you say something that we haven't seen yet, which is washings of. What does that mean, a washing of something?
That means the item was small enough that I could actually place the item in a tube and add reagent to it. And it's what we call a washing, because it's not a swabbing and it's not a cutting of. We're washing that item to recover any DNA that may be from it. And then we remove the item from the liquid, and then that goes on for DNA extraction.
Sure. Do you find that to be a reliable method?
Yes, we use it in other items of evidence too.
Okay. And we're going to show you what's been marked. Again, we're not opening these. Show you what's been marked in this case is exhibit number 285 and 286. I believe testified from Investigator Leatherberry as metal fragments recovered from the basement of the Halderson home. Are those the items that we're discussing?
Yes.
And did you, in fact, wash those items?
Yes, I did.
Were these items you were able to perform blood tests on?
No, based on the limited amount of sample size, it went on for DNA analysis.
Sure. And what was the result of the DNA analysis on items L1 and M1, which is also, I guess for our purposes, exhibits 285 and 286?
They were single source mail profiles from the same individual, and Bart Halderson was the source of that profile.
Okay. Next, and we're just going to go through the whole report even when it maybe didn't lead to anything. Here you indicate the swab from the stain on the tarp, item C2E1. Was this another stain you found on the tarp?
Yes.
And for everyone's purposes, is item C and then C2 the sub-designation?
Yes.
And you say partial low-level profile not suitable for comparisons due to limited amount of genetic information. Just explain that for us.
So sometimes when we develop DNA profiles, sometimes we don't get great profiles. And in this case, that was the instance where I didn't get anything that I could really make any conclusions on. So our procedure is to say a partial low-level profile and not make any comparisons to it.
Okay. You were able to find some comparisons, however, with other areas of that same tarp?
Yes.
Okay. And so now we're looking at your testing done on item C2F1, which we talk about the tarp, talking about the one in the garbage can, right?
Yes.
Okay. And what conclusions did you reach regarding that staining?
I detected a single source female profile, and Crystal Halderson was the source of that profile.
Same numerical value that you previously gave regarding the sample?
Yes.
What is StarMix?
StarMix is a probabilistic genotyping software that we use in the lab, and it has the ability to deconvolute complex mixtures and then perform likelihood ratio calculations on those profiles when given a standard for reference.
And because of my question, perhaps we're about to see some of that testing done in this case, or those results, correct?
Yes.
All right. Can you explain what a likelihood ratio is?
If you want to go to the next slide, I can.
Sure. So here, for everyone's purposes, we're looking at the StarMix slide from your lab report labeled swab from stain near where tape was inside garbage bin on item C1C1. Talk about this.
So a likelihood ratio is a ratio of two different hypotheses, and the statistic calculated gives support for one hypothesis over the other. So in this case, the top part of the table, it says H1. That's the first hypothesis, and that consists usually of the person of interest and an unknown individual, because in this case, it's a two-person mixture, so the person of interest and an unknown individual. And then the second hypothesis is that it's two unknown individuals.
How do you construct those likelihood ratio proportions?
It's based on the case information that we are given. And like I said, H1 is usually a hypothesis that the person of interest is included in that. And H2 is a hypothesis where the person of interest is not included.
Okay. And when you say person of interest, do you mean any of these standards being the person of interest?
Yes, on the left side of the table, each standard that I made a comparison to, they're listed. So it's Bart Halderson, Krista Halderson, Mitchell Halderson, and Chandler Halderson's. Each of their standards were compared to the evidence profile in this case.
In this case, you use StarMix?
Yes.
Can you tell us why?
Based on our procedure manual, I needed to use StarMix in this case.
Sure. What is the mathematical process used by StarMix?
The mathematical process is a random resampling, and to be able to best explain the data and all the possible genotypes that could be part of this profile.
Are the methods you've described here for StarMix, are they generally accepted by people who do what you do for a living?
Yes.
So let's start talking about it. So as we go through, we're going to see some of the more simple line results, and then maybe we're going to see some more complex ones. This is StarMix?
Yes.
All right. When we're looking at this, let's start from the top. We're talking about a stain near where the tape was inside item C1, this large box here. And tell us what the jury is looking at here.
So you're looking at the table of the results and the conclusions from this. The first part says that it was a partial low-level two-person mixture. So when I was doing the analysis of the profile, I determined that more than one person contributed to this profile, and I knew that at least one male was included. So then that information is given to StarMix, and it deconvolutes the mixture and lets me know if it's has good results that I can go and do statistics from standards on. And in this case, it did. And then I have each standard compared to that profile, and it gives me a statistic of whether or not they can be included or excluded or uninformative.
In dealing with a situation in which every person of interest, and not using the term person of interest as a police officer might, and as I think you robbed the Walmart, as in person of interest meaning the person who you believe possibly might be have their DNA included in this mix. Sometimes is it possible to see people who are biologically related have small support or moderate support for inclusion?
Yes, it's possible.
And I think when you started talking at the beginning, you indicated that we get our DNA from our parents.
Yes.
And just what amount of DNA do you get from your parents?
You get 50% from your fathers and 50% from your mother.
Sure. And here you've reach some sort of qualifier as to your conclusion, very strong support, uninformative, moderate support, things of that sort.
Yes.
Okay. Let's start at the top. For Mr. Bart Halderson, related to the staining on where the tape was inside the garbage bin, what was your conclusion?
That it was at least 43 billion times more likely to observe this DNA profile as a mixture from H1, which is person of interest plus unknown, than if it's a mixture resulting from H2, which is from 2 unknown individuals.
Okay. And Krista, it's uninformative?
Yes.
Meaning?
I'm not making any type of conclusions on if they're included or excluded based on the statistic calculated.
And for Mitchell Halderson, it's indicated as moderate support for inclusion.
Yes.
And explain again, if you could, what moderate support for inclusion means.
The moderate support for inclusion was developed when we did our validation, and it was determined that it was a support for inclusion, but it was just above our cutoff. For
what is that cutoff?
1,000.
And what is Mitchell?
2,670 times more likely.
Compared to where you find very strong support with Bart, it was 43 billion times more likely.
Yes.
Okay. And lastly, for Chandler Halderson, you wrote uninformative?
Yes.
All right. Here, now, we're talking about the scissors, and we'll do the same process as we're talking through this. I'll have the detective glove up. And first, I'll have him show you the box where we're talking about item D1. For the jury's purpose, that's been
Yes.
marked as exhibit number 142 in our case. Is that the item labeled scissors that I think you previously talked about some of the blood you found?
Yes.
All right, we'll go ahead and have the detective display those for the jury. And I'll ask you some questions. Same 4 possible persons of interest in using star mix, and what were your results here?
The swabbing from the handles of the scissors, I detected a 2-person mixture with at least 1 male.
And did you reach some conclusions regarding those persons of interest?
Bart Halderson was at least 1 quadrillion times more likely to observe the profile if it is a mixture of H1 than it is a mixture of H2.
Okay. And Krista Halderson?
The same result.
At least 1 quadrillion more likely to observe that profile than an unknown person?
Yes.
Okay. The number quadrillion is a large number?
Yes.
How large of a number is that?
It's a 1 with 15 zeros after it.
Okay. And here, Mitchell and Chandler excluded?
Yes.
We don't need to display it again, but here, obviously, there was some additional staining on the scissors, item D2.
Yes, I took swabbings from the staining on the blade of the scissors.
Okay. And the jury already saw that, but the scissors, but what were your conclusions or reached here?
It was a 2-person mixture with at least 1 male. Again, Bart Halderson was at least 1 quadrillion times more likely to observe this DNA profile as a mixture of H1 than if it is H2. Krista Halderson, it was at least 1 quadrillion times more likely to observe this DNA profile as a mixture resulting from H1 than if it is a mixture resulting from H2. Mitchell Halderson was excluded, and Chandler Halderson was excluded.
Okay. Next item we're going to talk about, and we'll have the detective assist us, is your item E1 for purposes of the jury. We're talking about item or exhibit 141, which is the broken saw blade. I believe testimony was reportedly recovered from the Irwin Road property. So we'll have the detective just pull that out as we discuss it.
Yes.
And you were answering the question, is that in fact the item E1 from the lab?
Yes.
Okay, we'll have the detective remove it. And as he carefully does that, tell me about your conclusions using StarMix here.
So I detected a partial low-level 2-person mixture with at least 1 male. Bart Halderson, the result was very strong support for inclusion, and it was at least 1 quadrillion times more likely to observe the DNA profile as a mixture resulting from H1 than if it's a mixture resulting from H2.
And then Krista, Mitchell, and Chandler were uninformative?
Yes.
Next, we're going to talk about the all-way handsaw. I think you labeled it item F, so Frank, and then sub-designated F1 was the swabbing you took?
Yes.
Okay, and for everyone's purposes, that's Exhibit 140. And sorry for the delay. Obviously, the detective wants to change his gloves each time, but we'll have him show you exhibit number 140 for our purposes. Is that item F for your purposes?
Yes.
Okay. And we'll have the detective open that up, display it for the jury. And while you describe the results, what were your results on item F1?
I detected a two-person mixture with at least one male. Bart Halderson had very strong support for inclusion. It was at least 1 quadrillion times more likely to observe this DNA profile if it's a mixture resulting from H1 than resulting from H2. Krista Halderson, it was very strong support for inclusion. It was at least 1 quadrillion times more likely to observe the DNA profile as a mixture from H1 than from H2. And Mitchell Halderson and Chandler Halderson were excluded.
Next, and of course, the detective will go through the process of changing gloves. We're going to talk about item G in this case, which is the pruning shears for the jury's purposes, exhibit number 139, purportedly recovered from the Irwin Road property, I believe is the testimony. And we'll have the detective, one second. And we'll have the detective continue to show him, but we're going to start talking about the results because there's numerous results as to this one. Tell us about item G1.
G1 was the swapping of the black rubber handle on the pruning shears. I detected a two-person mixture with at least one male. And the results for each individual was Bart Halderson had very strong support for inclusion. It was at least 1 quadrillion times more likely to observe the DNA profile if it was a mixture from H1 than if it was a mixture resulting from H2. Krista Halderson had very strong support for inclusion. It was at least 1 quadrillion times more likely to observe the DNA profile if it is a mixture resulting from H1 than if it's a mixture resulting from H2. Mitchell Halderson was excluded and Chandler Halderson was excluded.
Okay, briefly, the detective's going to open the box. I know we've all seen it before, but I just want to make sure everyone's seeing the same thing. That's your item that we're talking about?
Yes.
All right, we'll go to the other swabbing you took from there, which was G2. What did you find here?
Again, it was a swabbing of the staining on the red metal handle portion of the pruning shears. It was a two-person mixture and at least one male. Bart Halderson had very strong support for inclusion. It was at least 1 quadrillion times more likely to observe the DNA profile if it is a mixture resulting from H1 than if it is a mixture resulting from H2. Krista Halderson had very strong support for inclusion. It is at least 1 quadrillion times more likely to observe the DNA profile if it is a mixture resulting from H1 than if it's a mixture resulting from H2. Mitchell Halderson was excluded and Chandler Halderson was excluded.
Excellent. And the detective will repackage that and you can take a seat for a second. Next, we're going to talk about this item, I think being referred to as the barn tarp, item S1 that you previously looked at. You performed this work on this item, on the stainings on the barn tarp. What were you able to conclude?
The swab from the stain on the barn tarp was a two-person mixture and at least one male. Bart Halderson had very strong support for inclusion. It was at least 1 quadrillion times more likely to observe the DNA profile if it was a mixture from H1 than if it's a mixture resulting from H2. Krista Halderson had very strong support for inclusion. It was at least 1 quadrillion times more likely to observe the DNA profile if it was a mixture resulting from H1 than if it's a mixture resulting from H2. Mitchell Halderson was excluded and Chandler Halderson was excluded.
Okay. And we don't have to read it again, but you did another swab from the same tarp, correct?
Yes.
And that has identical results.
Yes.
Bart and Krista, each 1 quadrillion times more likely to be observed than a anyone else? It was a random person. Or, excuse
It was
me,
at least
the hypothesis.
1 quadrillion times more likely to observe the DNA profile if it was a mixture resulting from H1 than H2.
You then performed another report in this case. So that's exhibit number 418, correct?
Yes.
I'll hand you that report for reference. Same format. You examined a lot of items.
Yes.
However, many of these are swabs, correct, that we're looking at here?
I'd say half are swabs. The other half were bags labeled.
Okay. First thing in your report is items you identified blood on?
Yes.
All right. Let's talk about those briefly. There's items starting with the letter W labeled paper towels. What were those?
Paper towels.
Yeah, and do you have a description in general for item W of what that was?
There was a box containing several bags of what were called, that contained paper towels.
Okay, and you were able to identify blood on that?
On 4 of them I tested.
Okay.
There was blood.
All right. Next, we have a swab reportedly recovered from the family room, swab G, family room. These items labeled G by the investigators that were involved in the case?
Yes.
And you sub-designated that or designated as X6?
Yes, there were 7 or 8 swabs in that one item submitted.
Next, you were able to identify blood on the axe, item AC?
Yes.
Okay, and this one we'll actually want to look at. So I'll have the detective come up. He can grab that. I'll actually move some of this out of his way. I'm going to have the detective show you item AC, and you can just let us know, in fact, is that have the stickers from your lab labeled as that item. You can take a look at that if you need to get up. That's fine.
It has our label M21-1575 AC on the box.
Sure. And we'll pause on opening that until we get to the section and talk about the actual findings. But where on that item were you able to locate blood?
Do you mind if I refer to my notes?
Absolutely fine. Thank you.
I did the testing to confirm for blood on the staining near the hilt of the axe.
Okay. How would you describe where the hilt is?
It's where the axe head and the handle meet.
Okay. Next, some shoes recovered in this case. You labeled as items AD1 and AD2. You found blood on those shoes?
Yes.
Can you tell us whereabouts on those shoes you found blood?
The bottoms of the shoes.
Okay. And I'll have the detective just show you what's been marked and received in this case. And if you could look and see if your lab sticker is in fact on that.
Yes, it is.
There were some jeans or pants that you labeled as AE, and you recovered blood there?
Yes.
Okay. What is the difference between blood identified in this report and this next section, which we hadn't seen before, which is presumptive testing for blood positive, however, could not be confirmed?
So presumptive testing for blood is what a lot of people are familiar with. It's the chemical test, and if blood is indicated, it will turn pink. And then I went to do the confirmatory test for blood, and I did not see 2 lines. I only had 1 line. So I could say that it was presumptive for blood was positive, but I could not confirm blood on those items.
Okay. And those items were a swab from the living room fireplace and a swab from the Southside basement area?
Yes.
Okay. And then what does the next section mean, just presumptive testing for blood positive? And what's different from the blood was identified section?
So presumptive testing for blood was positive on the paper towels and the swabs listed, but I didn't take those on to do a confirmatory test. I took a representative sampling to confirm for blood. And the rest of these items just had the presumptive testing done.
Lindsay, we're going to mark an exhibit if you have a sticker. And those items, paper towels, swab from the family room, there were some swabs from the fireplace and Southside basement area.
Yes,
Okay. Same as before. You prepared the items for analysis, meaning you swabbed them or did the cuttings, and you did some analysis. Here, the first couple are unsuitable. Again, remind us what that means.
just means I didn't detect any DNA, so I couldn't go on for further analysis.
And however, you were able to perform some analysis on a good deal of these items.
Yes.
Let's start with this one. A swab from the living room, or the family room, excuse me, item X1A, and the swabbing from the stain on the sole of the shoe that you had, item AD2B. Tell me what your conclusions were here.
They were single source mail profiles from the same individual, and Bart Halderson was the source of those profiles.
Sure. For the jury's purpose, some of the swabs we're talking about here came from the fireplace. I believe Investigator Leatherberry testified to some of those. But here we're talking about the shoe and a swabbing from the family room. And you identified Mr. Halderson?
Yes.
Same numerical value as you previously talked about, being 1 in 7 trillion?
Yes.
Okay. Swab from the family room, item X2 through X7, and cuttings from the stain on the jeans, item AE2 and AE3. You were able to observe, or able to determine a single source male profile. Tell me those results.
Detected a single source male profile from the same individual. Chandler M. Halderson was the source of those profiles.
And you used the phrase family room. Were you aware that that was the designation being used by the investigators in certain areas of the home? They were calling areas basement or family room, things of that sort?
Yes, whatever they had written on the transmittal is what we used for our description.
Okay. Next, we'll talk about swab from the north side of the basement, items Y1A, Y3A, Y5A, and Y6A. Here, these were swabs taken from the same general area. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
Okay. And did you perform some analysis on them?
Yes, I was able to detect single source female profiles from the same individual, and Krista Halderson was the source of those profiles.
Were you able to perform blood testing on that swab?
On those swabs?
Yes.
No, I did not perform blood testing on those swabs.
Can you tell us why not?
There wasn't very much staining on those items when I examined them. And I talked to Detective Leatherberry about whether they wanted blood identified or to go on for DNA analysis. And per a conversation with him, he said he had done some blood testing on one of the items. And then the other ones I would just do DNA analysis on.
And were these, were you aware they were swabs of blood pattern that was on a safe in the basement?
I knew they were from a safe, but I didn't know what they were of.
Okay. And did you rely on Mr. Leatherberry's representations then, or at least in determining whether DNA was more important at that time? Is that how you made your decision?
Yes.
Next, we'll talk about the swab from the living room fireplace, item N. And so for the jury's purposes, I suppose I I put it up there. Item N being maybe in the center. Item N, what are we looking at there for a result?
I had a partial low-level male profile detected, and when comparing the standards, Chandler Halderson was the source of that profile.
Next, we'll talk about the south side basement area. I believe it was labeled F by some of the investigators involved. There, what were you able to determine?
I detected a partial low-level 3-person mixture, but this profile was unsuitable for comparisons due to the limited amount of genetic information and the complexity of the mixture.
Now we're going to look at some star mix results again.
Yes.
Okay. Here, talking about living room, fireplace, item O. And what were you able to determine based on the swabbing from item O?
I detected a partial low-level 3-person mixture in at least one male. Bart Halderson had very strong support for inclusion. It was at least 1 quadrillion times more likely to observe this DNA profile if it was a mixture from Bart Halderson and 2 unknown individuals, or H1, than if it was a mixture resulting from 3 unknown individuals, or H2. Krista Halderson had strong support for inclusion. It was at least 10,000 times more likely to observe this DNA profile if it was a mixture resulting from H1 than if it was a mixture resulting from H2. Mitchell Halderson was uninformative, and it was 2,940 times more likely to observe this DNA profile if it was a mixture from Chandler Halderson and 2 unknown individuals than if it was a mixture resulting from 3 unknown individuals, which is a moderate support for inclusion.
Now we're going to talk about a swab. I think Mr. Leatherberry testified yesterday, area G that he was able to identify. You did star mix on it. What were your conclusions?
I detected a partial low-level 2-person mixture that contained at least 1 male. Bart Halderson had very strong support for inclusion. It was at least 1 quadrillion times more likely to observe this DNA profile was a mixture resulting from H1 than if it was a mixture resulting from H2. Krista Halderson was uninformative. It was at least 1,280 times more likely to observe this DNA profile if it was a mixture resulting from H1 than a mixture resulting from H2, which was a moderate support for inclusion, and Chandler Halderson was uninformative.
Next, and we'll get the item out again, just so we're looking at the same thing. Swabbing on the staining of the axe head. I think you testified previously to various areas of the axe head that were tested, but let's start with this one. Item AC1, so when you swabbed near the axe head, tell us what your results were.
I did 2-person mixture that it contained at least 1 male. Bart Halderson had very strong support for inclusion. It was at least 1 quadrillion times more likely to observe this DNA profile if it was a mixture resulting from H1 than if it was a mixture resulting from H2. Krista Halderson also had very strong support for inclusion. It was at least 106 million times more likely to observe this DNA profile if it was a mixture resulting from H1 than if it was a mixture resulting from H2. Mitchell Halderson had moderate support for exclusion. It was 2,600 times more likely to observe this mixture if it was resulting from H2 than if it was a mixture resulting from H1. And Chandler Halderson was uninformative.
AC2, near the hilt of the axe handle, is this where you said you were able to detect blood?
I identified blood, yes.
Could you point for the jury, I know we described it previously, without touching it, the detectives holding the axe, where is, in fact, the area in which you were able to identify blood?
There's a silver circle near where the axe head and the handle meet, and that's where I swabbed.
Okay. And I'll have the detective place it back. As we're talking about this result, AC2, I know you've been reading a lot, but there you found a 2-person mixture with at least 1 male, and then you reached some conclusions. That is for Bart Halderson, very strong support for inclusion.
Yes.
Krista Halderson, very strong support for inclusion.
Yes.
And you excluded both Mitchell and Chandler.
Yes.
You then swabbed the top part of the axe, item AC3. There, you reached conclusions. Very strong support for inclusion for Bart.
Yes.
Very strong support for Krista.
Yes.
And you excluded both Mitchell and Chandler.
Yes.
Next, we're going to talk about a pair of shoes. And I'll have the detective, if he could, in a second, walk up with a pair of shoes. In fact, they're already up there. Here in this case, you were asked to identify or to examine a pair of Brooks shoes that were brought to the crime lab.
Yes.
And are you aware that other disciplines at the crime lab, people who do footwear testing and things of that sort, they were also involved?
Yes.
Just might be a good break or a good time to ask you. A lot of different disciplines work together at the crime lab.
Yes.
Fingerprints, footwear analysis, trace evidence, DNA, things like that.
Yes.
How do you decide what order things are tested when they come in? We plop this on your desk one day. Who goes first?
It depends on what the question is being asked of us to find. Some cases, if there's biological staining, we'll take our samples first, because sometimes the process for latent prints could destroy any DNA that we may want to do in the future. Sometimes items, depending on what they are best suited for latent prints to examine first, and then DNA. It's just a discussion between the assigned analyst on what the best, what is best to do first.
Okay. In this case, you were asked to swab the inside of the shoes near the heel, or that's what you decided to do. Why would one swab the inside of the shoes?
You might want to know who was wearing them.
Okay. Here, we're looking at the left Brooks shoe in that bag that's in front of you. We don't have to do anything with it right now. It's there. You reached some results, and that is uninformative for Bart, very strong support for inclusion for Krista, and uninformative for Mitchell, but very strong support for Chandler.
Yes, it was a 4-person mixture and that had at least one male.
And you examined the other shoe as well, right?
Yes.
And we'll skip ahead too. Here's the right shoe. And there, very strong support for exclusion for Bart. You exclude Krista. Very strong support for exclusion of Mitchell, but very strong support for inclusion of Chandler.
Yes.
Meaning Mr. Halderson, Mr. Chandler Halderson is the only one with the left and right shoe that had strong support for inclusion of some sort.
Yes.
Okay. There was a stain you previously testified about on the bottom of those shoes. You labeled it sub-designation AD1B. Your conclusions there for the staining on the bottom of the shoes. Bart Halderson, strong support for inclusion.
Yes.
Krista Halderson, very strong support for inclusion.
Yes.
Mitchell Halderson, moderate support for exclusion.
Yes.
And Chandler Halderson, moderate support for inclusion.
Yes.
Okay. Was that the stain that you previously testified was blood?
Yes.
This perhaps hasn't come into the case, but you were provided and we're just going to present everything, you were provided a pair of jeans at some point.
Yes.
And that those pair of jeans were items AE1, and you found very strong support for inclusion of Chandler, and you excluded everybody else.
Yes.
Your last report that you did was much shorter, I would imagine, than all of the other reports. Showing you report number 560. When was this report dated?
November 8th, 2021.
And is it fair to say the police at some point found a gun and they brought it out to you to see if there was any DNA on it?
Yes.
And were you able to find any?
I took 3 swabbings from the rifle, and the results had very limited human DNA, limited male DNA, which means it was unsuitable for further analysis.
Okay. You couldn't draw any conclusions from it?
Right.
Okay. Are guns a difficult object to detect DNA on sometimes?
They can be, yes.
Do you examine guns often in your job?
Yes.
And are you always able to extract DNA from somewhere on that gun when you sample it?
No.
If you want a drink of water now, might be a good time. I'm going to ask a couple questions of everyone, but we might be getting close to the end. Okay?
Okay.
Examination?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. So a couple questions for you. Earlier, Mr. Brown mentioned something about the crime lab being able to only test a limited amount of items. Is that correct?
They can. We can accept more, but usually we like a heads up first.
Okay. So I think the number 10 was used. Is that just a typical number that's assigned to homicide cases?
Yes.
And the state can certainly ask for more than 10 items to be tested.
Yes.
They're not limited in the amount of items. In other words, no more than 20 items can be tested, correct?
We just like to limit it just so it doesn't become very overwhelming. They can certainly ask for more to be submitted.
Of course, and that makes sense. Now, we talked a lot about DNA in general and blood. So if I hold this pen and you swab it, my DNA is going to be on this pen, correct?
Potentially, yes.
And there's no blood, just take my word for it. There's no blood on this pen. So you're still going to be able to pick up some DNA on that, correct?
Potentially, yes.
And that's why, and please correct me if I'm wrong, sometimes when we're designating or when the crime lab was designating swabs, there was just a general swab of blah versus swab of staining of blah. Does that sound about right?
Right.
So is it fair to assume that if there was a staining in front of that swab or in that swab, that's testing for DNA of the staining in particular, yes?
Potentially, yes.
And if it just said the general swab, then that would be just general swabbing, no blood detected or no blood necessary, yes?
Potentially, yes.
And just to give you a better example, let's see. If you want to look at your September 1st report, and I'm looking at, does the bottom have bait stamps for you?
Do you have the page number?
Yeah, I'm looking at 2,903.
Exhibit 417?
Yes, thank you, Judge.
2903, you said?
Yep.
Yep.
So right in the middle of that page, it says swabbing of handles of scissors, correct?
Yes.
And then right below that, it says swabbing of staining on blades on scissors, correct?
Yes.
So the first one, is it safe to assume that it's just a general swab of the handles?
Yes, trying to avoid any type of staining seen on the handle.
And the second one is more specific to staining seen on the
Blade.
on that particular item.
On the blade, yes.
And then while we're looking at that sample of the handles in general, Mr. Halderson was excluded. And by Mr. Halderson, I mean Chandler was excluded.
Yes.
Now, let's talk about the standards used. And when I say standards, I'm talking about the individuals that were compared to that sample, correct?
Yes.
So as far as standards given, it sounds like there were just 4 samples or 4 standards that the crime lab used, correct?
Those were what were submitted to the lab, yes.
So if there were any other standards or any other individuals that were trying to get comparison from items, those would have been provided in your report, correct?
Yes, results would have been given.
Judge, can we approach? Ms. Vera used the example of a pen. If I touched a pen and it was swabbed, what could cause DNA to come off of a pen?
If someone was wearing a glove, if they had wiped the item down after touching it,
Do cleaning products have any impact on DNA?
potentially, yes.
In your work, are you able to tell particularly how DNA, when you find no DNA, are you able to say why or why not it wasn't there?
No,
It could be wiped off,
yes,
and it could be cleaning products,
yes,
or it could have never been there in the first place.
correct,
Okay. You are a scientist, and your results are limited to those reports?
yes.
Okay. No further questions.
May this witness be excused.
Excused but not
Yes.
released. Yes.
Excused but not released.
And I think we will.
You take your reports, but I'll take the paper exhibits that you have, and we'll get everything else cleared up in a little bit. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day. And did the state wish to proceed with some additional testimony from one of the case detectives?
Yes.
I think we'll go, ladies and gentlemen, without a break, but we'll be breaking a little bit earlier for the day as a result, if that's all right. Unless anybody needs a time or a moment, then we can go forward. Hi. Go right ahead.
I'm going to call for limited purpose Detective Sabrina Sims. I need the HDMI over here.
You solemnly swear affirm the testimony you're about to give in this matter is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Judge, if you could turn off the HDMI until we're ready.
Oh, no, turn back on to the HD.
No. Just turn it off until we're
Turn
ready.
it off. Okay, I'm sorry.
Sorry, just didn't want it to see it.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon. Is your name still Sabrina Sims?
Yes, it is.
And you are one of the two case detectives in this case.
Yes, I am.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the different areas that were searched by police in connection to this case. Of course, one place that was searched was the Irwin Road address in Cottage Grove, Dane County, Wisconsin.
Yes.
And that was searched primarily because a human torso was found on the land.
That's correct.
Okay. And we've also talked with Greg Leatherberry and others. The 4595 Oak Springs Circle address in Windsor, Dane County, Wisconsin, was also searched by police.
Yes.
And that's primarily because of information that came out of seeing Chandler Halderson as being the person that was seen close to where the torso was. So you were looking for a crime scene.
That's correct.
Okay. I'm going to show you what has been marked as exhibits 459 through 465. If you would look at exhibits 459 through 465. And as a group, would you describe those exhibits as photographs of other locations searched by the Dane County Sheriff's Office?
Yes, I would.
I would move exhibits 459 through 465 into evidence at this time.
No objection.
They are received.
And I would ask to publish.
You may publish.
And I will take the HDMI now.
Attorney Raymond, is the podium in your way as far as sight lines to the witness?
No,
Oh,
it's fine
okay.
for me.
I couldn't tell from my angle. Thank you, Attorney Brown.
Okay. I think it's connected if it's turned, is it turned on?
Thank you.
Okay. Detective Sims, what does Exhibit 459 show?
This is a drone image of the backyard of the Halderson home, overlooking the pond area directly behind the Halderson home.
And was this pond area searched?
Yes, it was.
Tell me about that. How did the Dane County Sheriff's Office search the pond?
It was definitely done with a lot of thought, with cooperation with the pond owner, all of the residents that lived on the pond. We had to get consent from all of them. Obviously, we've taken in consideration the wildlife and fish around the pond. We didn't want to disturb that as part of our decision making. We searched the pond because of the proximity to the residents, being directly behind the residents. At the point the decision was made to search the pond, we were still looking for numerous items of evidence. If you can see in this photograph, I guess it would be on the right side, that is our dive team truck. We had our dive team assist in part of this search. So they obviously got into the water. They also had difficulty in the search because, as you can see, there's numerous weeds growing in the pond. So as the search started, some of the divers who are Dane County deputy sheriffs, they just were struggling with the environment and the weeds below the water. So a decision was made in cooperation again with the pond owner, and we also used Dane County Parks to assist in cutting weeds out of the park or out of the pond. So we brought in a weed cutter and methodically cut weeds out so that the divers would have an easier time searching the area to try to get to the bottom of the pond.
Did the team also search all the weeds that they cut to make sure no items of evidence were missed?
Yes, we did. That happened over 2 days, actually. The weeds were cut, taken on a conveyor belt, transported to the Dane County Law Enforcement Training Center, laid out in different batches, and searched by hand, and also a cadaver canine ran around the different piles of weeds as well.
Showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 460. Is this just a different view of the pond?
Yes, it is.
And that's after some of the water has been drained. Is that fair?
That is fair to say. I should backtrack. The decision initially was to drain the pond to assist the divers. As is with any plan, sometimes that changes because as the water was decreasing in the pond, it actually made it more difficult for the divers. So at that point, the decision was made to cut the weeds.
Did it become more difficult because of the mud?
Yes, on the bottom, from what I was told, it was, there was a lot of silt at the bottom. The divers were kind of getting stuck, as they were trying to get to the bottom, feeling by hand, but also, with their feet.
And at the end of the day, was anything of evidentiary value located in the pond?
No, it was not.
Now I'm going to show you what's already been received as Exhibit 532. This is the Snapchat that the girlfriend Kat Melander took of Chandler at the Roxbury location. Did that lead to a search?
Yes, it did.
And that's the search that we've heard previously about, where the legs of Mrs. Halderson were collected.
Yes.
We heard Greg Leatherberry yesterday talk about how the trash can tested positive for blood. Based on that information, what, if any, searches did the Dane County Sheriff's Office perform?
So we actually had talked about the red staining that Deputy Leatherberry observed on the garbage can, and his plan was to test that staining, and if it tested positive for blood and then human blood, we had made the decision that we were going to search a landfill. So we had a detective, I guess basically follow from where the truck picked up the trash at the Windsor residence, where that trash went, which ultimately was a transfer point, and it ended up in a landfill in Jefferson County, a waste management landfill. We also had confirmation that the trash went out on Monday, July 5th, 2021. And we had that information because we know the route, but also because of the surveillance video that we got from 111 Oak Springs. So we actually saw the garbage can and the recycle bin wheeled to the curb by Chandler. So based on the time frame from when the garbage went out to when we had started our investigation, we felt that it was necessary to search the landfill, knowing that that task would be, very, very challenging. Something that, in my experience as a detective, or actually as the sheriff's office for Dane County, we have never done.
Okay. And I'm showing you Exhibit 461. What in the world is Exhibit 461?
Again, this is a drone image of the landfill. It's the Deer Track landfill in Watertown, which is in Jefferson County. This was taken as part of our recon of the area. This was the area that Detective Meyerhofer had worked with the landfill management and determined that this was the cell area where we believed that the trash from the Halderson residence ended up.
Okay. And Exhibit 462, how would you describe Exhibit 462?
Again, this is just a drone image overlooking the area. You can see, I guess, to the far left of the screen, that is Interstate 94. And then kind of directly in the center of the screen, towards the bottom, is the specific cell or trash area we were going to be searching.
Exhibit 463. Could you please describe that for
Yes,
the jury?
463 is, I guess, as the process was going, this was taken, as you can see, there's plastic bags all over the place, there's wood, there's actually an individual standing pretty much in the center, upper center of the picture. He's wearing a yellow shirt and blue hard hat. He's standing basically in the cell area that they searched. The cell area, if I remember right, I want to say it was 50 feet wide by 50 feet. 50 feet wide by 50 feet, and then like 10 feet deep. It was a total of 20,000 cubic feet that they searched.
And was it basically they went piece by piece?
They did. Again, that was, meetings we had to logistically plan how to do that safely because of the environment you're going in, the safety equipment that was needed. We actually, deputies that worked at the landfill for the 2 weeks that we did that had to take an OSHA training before participating in the search. And that was done with, the best safety measures we could over the time period that we were there.
Exhibit 464.
464 is yet another image of the individual standing, more just for reference to determine like how deep the trash is. The individual standing there, he's approximately 5'9". So just for like a reference point of what you're looking at. Again, he's standing in the center of compacted trash. The trash is compacted numerous times. It's smashed from the time it gets taken from the curb in the truck to the transfer point. It's actually ran over with, it's almost like spikes smashed down to try to obviously tear it apart and smash it, which made it very difficult to search. You can see the torn pieces of paper, plastic, items you really can't even make out within this image.
And then finally, Exhibit 465.
This is
Another
just
picture of the dump search.
Yes. This is just a close-up, again, just trying to show the depth of the trash that was being searched.
Now, did the search team come across any items of blood?
They did.
And did those end up being of any evidentiary value?
No, they did not. I should say that we were working in conjunction with the medical examiner's office and the forensic anthropologist, Dr. Christina Figueroa Soto, as well, in case we did come across anything. There were some bones that were found, none of those determined to be human bone. There was medical waste, bags of blood, stuff like that.
And about how many people were involved in that search?
I would say each day it was approximately 10 to 12 people for a total of 10 days, that same amount each day.
Okay, and did you receive any tips from citizens throughout this investigation?
We did.
About how many of those would you estimate?
I would say between 30 and 40.
And was each tip followed up on?
Yes.
Did one of those tips result in a search of the Lord of Love Church?
Yes, it did.
Windsor, Wisconsin?
Yes, it did.
How long, and can you just tell me about that property and how it was searched?
Yep, so that tip came in, I want to say 2 weeks into the investigation. I want to say it was July 17th that we actually searched that area. The church itself is located south of the Halderson home, so in close distance-wise to the home. So we put a search team together based on the information from the tipster that there was an odor coming from some of the grass property that was behind the church. There's also like a walkway around that area. Ultimately, it was determined there was actually some sewer work being done in that area. We did search it with a large search team, a cadaver canine, and ultimately located nothing.
Did you guys also search the town of Burke Park, which is right outside of Sun Prairie, Wisconsin?
Yes, we did.
Why did you search that area?
Throughout the investigation, we were talking to numerous witnesses, people that knew Chandler Halderson. We had received information from some of the people that we interviewed that it was a park that Mr. Halderson or Chandler would frequent or had been to in the past. It's a very rural park. There's a waterway there. There's a bridge and a large field you can walk across. So we thought, using our resources on the same day of the Lord of Love search, we would search the town of Burke Park to determine if we could find any evidence there, and ultimately we did not.
Was the Pine Island Wildlife Area in Portage, Wisconsin searched?
Yes, it was.
Why was that area searched?
At that point in the investigation, when we decided to search that area, we had received cell phone records from Chandler's cell phone. So this had been weeks into the investigation. We worked with an analyst who mapped his cell phone records, and we had determined that there was a trip to the Pine Island Wildlife Area, which is in Columbia County, which is an area that is along the Wisconsin River. Chandler was out there late in the evening, between 10:30 and 11 at night. His cell phone was in that area for several minutes, and we just thought, based on all of the information we had so far in our investigation, how we had found, at this point, Krista Halderson's legs at the Wisconsin River in Roxbury, we thought we needed to search that area up in Portage as well.
And does that area run along the Wisconsin River?
It does.
And did you have your dive team out to that location?
Yes, we did. We actually conducted a search over a couple of different days. The landscape overall is challenging. There's bogs and different water I guess, waterways. The area in which we searched, it was right along Levee Road, which is a levee that butts up to the Wisconsin River. That river itself, the water level fluctuates quite a bit, and it also has a strong current. So we had searched it on foot with search teams one day, and ultimately deciding that we would try and put our divers into the water after a cadaver canine had alerted along the banks of one of the search areas. The Dane County Sheriff's Office dive team did go out there one day, also with the DNR and Columbia County Sheriff's Office. And one of our divers did get in the water, and immediately upon getting in the water, it was realized that it was very dangerous. It was something that our dive team had not done before in the Wisconsin River due to the current and just how strong the current was. It was such a dangerous situation that we basically pulled him back into the boat and did no more searching there.
But you mentioned a cadaver dog did alert along the shore.
Yes, we utilized a couple of different officers that have cadaver canines that are employed at the City of Madison Police Department, and we did a mutual aid request for their assistance.
No further questions at this time.
Cross-examination.
No, thank you.
Thank you very much, Detective. You can return back to the table. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are at a point where I'm advised by the state it is a good point to break. I wanted to let you know that back when we began and information provided to you during jury selection on Monday a week ago, I indicated that we had set aside 4 weeks. I can tell you with confidence that I don't know if this case will finish this week or next week, but you do not, and there's no, I think, conceivable way that a 4th week will be necessary to the extent you even remember me saying that, or if I did say it, I know when we were planning, we set aside more time than we thought might be necessary so that we had that time. So I just wanted to let you know that for now, for your purposes in planning, that the week after next, you won't be here, but I make no statements or promises about next week. Obviously, we know that we had committed to a 3-week time period here with certainty. And I wanted to tell you that the state is proceeding and seeking to present as much evidence as we can each day, even if we're stopping a little bit early today. I think it's a wise thing to do. We've been a little off schedule a bit this day, and there has been a good deal of information to take in this day. So we'll adjourn at this time. I'll ask you again to not take anything or allow anything to occur to you that would cause you to be exposed to discussions or to engage in discussions about the case or to learn anything or seek out any information about the case until we see you tomorrow morning. And we'll see you tomorrow morning at the usual time. We've been remarkable in being able to start on time most of the days, and I hope that continues. I'll see you ready to go at 8:45, weather permitting. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is James Langer, the Digital Content Manager for Channel3000.com. As you just heard, they're wrapping up for Day 6 here in the Chandler Halderson trial, but unlike what they had guessed at the start of the trial, it sounds like the judge was saying there that the case could be wrapped up as early as this week or next. So that kind of gives us the indication that A, the prosecution may be nearing the end of their case, and B, we may be getting close to the start of the defense laying out their case. And of course, after that, we'll have closing arguments before the case goes to the jury. Also, as the judge indicated, some pretty difficult to listen to testimony, I guess is the best way to describe it today, as we heard from both a medical examiner and representatives from the state crime lab on some of the physical evidence that was found and the testing on the human remains and that kind of thing. So before we wrap up for the day, in case you missed any of that, I'm just going to kind of go through some of my notes from the day and get you all caught up before we break for the evening. So basically what we had heard from this afternoon, we actually started with a pair of surveillance videos. So they called people in from Quick Trip who provided security camera video from the night of July 1st. It's something that they had previously shown earlier in the case where Chandler was seen walking into a Quick Trip location in Windsor, buying 2 bags of ice and then leaving. They also showed then surveillance video of Chandler the following morning, the morning of July 2nd, at about 7:30 or so, walking into a Fleet Farm, and the only thing he bought there was a black and silver tarp from Fleet Farm, and they had the receipts to show that he was the one who bought it. It was pretty clear security video too. They played all the videos in full, and of course that tarp sort of matches the description of the tarps that were found at one of the crime scenes, the Cottage Grove farm. There was the tarp that was found inside a garbage bin, as well as a tarp folded up inside the shed near where Bart Halderson's remains were found, and that tarp was eventually tested for DNA to determine whose blood was on it, and we'll get to that in a minute. But yeah, the defense started with basically that video of Chandler buying a tarp there that morning of July 2nd. Then we'd heard from the medical examiner, and this is where things got maybe a bit more difficult for the jury to hear. Just like when we heard the testimony on when Krista Halderson's remains were found, they didn't show the pictures on the big screen in the courtroom, instead electing to give the jury printed out photos instead, so they could look at them themselves and analyze them as much as they needed to, and have that reference point as the witness was testifying, but they didn't show it on the big screen for everybody else in the courtroom to see. It kind of just helps preserve the privacy of the victims in the case and that sort of thing. But what they had pictures of today was the autopsy of the human remains of Bart Halderson. So the medical examiner went through their testing of that and basically determined that Bart had died of gunshots. He was shot at least 3 times, according to the report, including once at very close range, almost contact range, they said, in the back. They don't know if that was the first shot or the last shot. It's impossible for them to tell the order of the shots, but that was one of the more significant gunshots, and they determined that those gunshots would have been the thing that killed him. They also ruled the manner of the death was homicide. So again, that's sort of what led prosecutors to eventually charge Chandler with homicide in this case as well. They went through multiple photos of the examination. They also, cut into the body to see what else was possibly injured, that kind of thing. And they also determined that the cuts, the dismemberment, happened after Bart was already dead. They can tell based on hemorrhaging when certain injuries occurred. So they determined that the gunshots happened while Bart was still alive, but he was dismembered after he had passed away. After that testimony, we heard from a DNA analyst from the Wisconsin State Crime Lab. That was one of the last witnesses we heard from this afternoon, and she testified on how she basically took samples from Krista Halderson's toothbrush. They had a DNA sample from Bart as well, but they also had DNA samples from both of their sons, both Mitchell and Chandler, so they could see whose DNA was on various items that were sent into the crime lab for testing. As we heard yesterday, there were dozens of items that maybe had blood on them or were areas of interest, and a lot of those did get tested. So to kind of run through some of the bloodstains that were tested, there were the bloodstains inside the garbage bin. The state crime lab found that Bart Halderson's DNA was found in those bloodstains. On the blades of scissors that were found discarded near where Bart's body was discarded, both Bart and Krista's DNA were found on the blades of those scissors. When it comes to the broken saw blade recovered from the Cottage Grove farm, also discarded in the same area as the scissors, Bart's DNA was found on that. Both Bart and Krista's DNA was found on a handsaw blade, And then when it comes to pruning shears, a pair of pruning shears that were also discarded, both Bart and Krista's DNA were found on there as well. When they took DNA swabs of the tarp that was found with apparent bloodstains on it in the shed nearby where Bart's body was found, they took 2 separate swabs on that, and both Bart and Krista's DNA were found there as well. So they were able to prove that's whose blood was on the tarp, that's whose blood was on those instruments. They also did swabs around the home as well, the area around the fireplace where they found those drops of blood. There they found DNA from Bart, Krista, and Chandler in that fireplace. When it comes to an axe that they also found inside the garage, kind of tucked away, almost like it was trying to be hidden, there was quite a few bloodstains on that, if you remember. There was bloodstains on the handle, there was bloodstains on the hilt of the axe where it met the axe head, and there was staining on the axe head itself. So there was multiple swabs taken of that axe. When it came to the blood that was near the hilt of the axe handle, both Bart and Krista's DNA was found there. Both Bart and Krista's DNA was found at the top of the axe. Staining on the axe head, again, both Bart and Krista's DNA found on that as well. So some pretty strong indicators there of DNA evidence on some of those items and cutting instruments too, that prosecutors presented today in their case. Another key piece of DNA evidence they presented were those pair of shoes. If you remember some of the testimony yesterday, they found a bunch of shoes in the family's garage, like a lot of families do, and there was in particular one set of shoes that was of interest because they found what they believed to be dried blood on the bottom of the shoes, on the sole, and in some spatter on the tongue of the shoe as well. So they not only tested those blood stains, but they also tested inside the heel of the left and the right shoe. The idea being that they could find out who was wearing those shoes that had the blood stains on it. So the blood stains, again, tested on that shoe, came back as both Bart and Krista's DNA on those blood stains. But when it came to who was possibly wearing the shoe, the only person whose DNA had strong indicators in both the left and the right shoe was Chandler. So prosecutors believe that those shoes were primarily worn by Chandler. He was the one wearing shoes that had his parents' bloodstains on them. So a lot of very interesting, to say the least, DNA evidence presented today, and just the sheer quantity of the things that they presented. There was a lot to go through. You know, the state crime lab DNA expert said usually they try to limit homicide cases to 10 DNA tests just to keep them from being overwhelmed. Investigators in this case blew well past that. They submitted many more than 10 samples. So just, again, as we heard from yesterday too, there was so much to go through in that house. Investigators spent weeks going through that, and they had multiple items to test. So that was just some of what the DNA uncovered today. It's for the first time that we're kind of seeing maybe some more concrete evidence, maybe linking Chandler to some of the things that he's accused of doing. So that was basically where the DNA expert left off. And then right before they broke for the day, they called Detective Sabrina Sims back to the stand. She testified earlier in the trial, but she's one of 2 primary case detectives in the case, and she detailed some of the additional searches that the sheriff's office conducted as part of this investigation. You know, we've talked a lot about the Halderson home, a lot about the farm out in Cottage Grove. Those were pretty much the 2 primary locations for the investigation, but they also followed up on 30 to 40 tips, they said, and they searched many other areas, including the pond in the Haldersons' backyard. They actually tried to drain it a little bit to help divers and investigators see if they could find anything in the pond. They said that actually made it worse. It made it tougher. So then they went in and they brought in a weed removal machine to kind of hack some of the weeds up and make it easier to search, because if you saw the picture of that pond, there was a lot of vegetation in there, kind of murky water. It's hard to decipher if anything's in there. So they cleared that out a little bit, searched through all the weeds that they did cut too, just to make sure that they didn't accidentally get rid of any evidence or anything or nothing was lost, and then continued their search there. But they said ultimately they didn't find any pieces of evidence in that pond. They also searched a landfill in Jefferson County, actually, because they had a detective basically follow the garbage truck as it picked up the garbage on the route along its route at the Halderson home, and followed that truck to see where it went, and it went to a landfill in Jefferson County. They searched that. They devoted a ton of resources there. They spent 10 days searching that area just because there's the sheer quantity of things in that landfill. They said, I think it was 20,000 cubic feet to search. So that's obviously a massive area to search, a lot of little items to poke through. They said they did find some bones and bloody items, but they were ultimately not related to the case. You know, it was a lot of medical waste, a lot of animal bone, that kind of thing. Nothing really related to this Halderson case was found in that landfill. So that was another place that they looked. They also searched a wildlife reserve area up in Portage along the Wisconsin River. They said they had a cadaver dog kind of give them a signal along the shore there, so they wanted to search that to make sure no human remains were there. They actually brought a dive team out, but if you're from Wisconsin and you know the Wisconsin River, that current can be quite literally deadly. There's people that drown in the Wisconsin River here every year. They pretty much quickly pulled that dive team member out when they realized the current was just too strong. It was not safe for them to search in that manner in that area. So they ended up not finding anything up there either. So just another idea of just how wide-reaching this investigation really did. It stretched out even beyond Dane County to quite a few areas across southern Wisconsin as well. It just kind of goes to show the tremendous amount of resources that the sheriff's office poured into this, looking for any and all pieces of evidence that they could to possibly solve this case. So that's kind of where we are right now. As I mentioned at the start of this little recap here, the judge did mention before he let the jurors go for the day that at this pace, they think that this case could possibly wrap up as soon as the end of this week or maybe next week, as opposed to that 3 or 4 week timeline that we had heard at the start and that the court had blocked off for this trial. So we could be possibly reaching near the end of the prosecution's case here. We could hear the defense's case soon. I know a lot of people are interested to hear what the defense's case will be in this case, especially considering the limited number of cross-examination questions that they've asked of the prosecution's witnesses so far. It's kind of been hard to maybe glean sometimes where the defense is going with their line of questioning. That might be more clear as they start to lay out their own case and once we get to closing arguments, whenever that may be. So that's the recap for today, basically. As a reminder, we're always recapping all of these over at channel3000.com every single day. You'll get basically a rundown of everything that happened every day of the trial. And if you missed anything at all, that's a great place to start, where you can go and get caught up. Every article we've ever written on this case is over there. Just go to channel3000.com, click the Halderson banner at the top of the page, and you'll be taken to that page right away. And that link is also in the description here of these live streams if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook as well. Super easy way to just click that link and you'll have basically everything you need to know about this case to get caught up if you missed any part of it at all. Furthermore, we have all of these entire days archived on our YouTube page. So just search for Channel 3000 on YouTube if you haven't already. And we have a playlist there at the top of our page that has each and every day of this trial. So if you want to get caught up on any days that you missed, that's the place to do it there as well. With that said, that's basically where we are for today, and we will kind of wrap things up here. Expecting to get underway again tomorrow morning at about the same time that we have every single morning here, about 8:45 in the morning Central Time. here in Madison, Wisconsin, and we'll see where the prosecution's case goes from here. But for now, again, I'm James Langer, the Digital Content Manager for Channel3000.com. Thanks for watching, everyone, and we will be back tomorrow morning. Have a good night.